All right, the Subcommittee on Energy, Climate, and Grid Security will now come to order. The chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. And I want to thank all the witnesses for being here as well. This is the second hearing we've had on this subject. Bill Johnson had a hearing last week in the Environment Subcommittee. This is sort of a follow-up for that, so I'm looking forward to it. So I want to thank you all for being here today, and welcome to the Energy, Climate, Grid Security Subcommittee hearing America's Future, Leading a New Era of Energy Dominance, Security, and Environmental Stewardship. The world is a safer and more secure place with American leadership. And this means leadership with our energy, with our technology, and with our values as we continue our path towards reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and cleaner air and water. We cannot lose sight of the role energy plays in assuring our economic future, our nation's security, and the security of our allies. We also cannot lose sight of the fact that the world will demand more energy, not less, in the future. Developing nations are hungry for the benefits of reliable, affordable energy that will help lift their people out of poverty and into prosperity. Because of this demand, there will be a great energy expansion in the coming years, and America should play a key role in this expansion, not retreat from it, and not deprive the world of the benefits of our abundant resources and technologies. Pro-growth energy policies and a predictable regulatory environment and the American entrepreneurial spirit enabled America to be a leader in energy production while simultaneously reducing emissions. We led the world in reducing carbon dioxide emissions while also becoming the world's #1 producer of both oil and natural gas. The air is cleaner globally, and our allies in Europe and Asia are more energy secure because of America's high-quality energy production and exports. Last week in our Environment, Manufacturing, and Critical Minerals Subcommittee, we highlighted how the United States is leading the world in reducing emissions of all types and the types of policies that have contributed to this success. Today, we'll focus on what is needed to continue success and preserve the benefits of American energy dominance, our security, and the environmental benefits that can flow from that. The United States have become the #1 producer of oil and natural gas because of policies that allow the private sector to innovate and advance their technologies. And we do it cleaner and safer than any other country. U.S. LNG exports are 40% cleaner than Russian LNG and is cleaner than other alternative fuels. Using our gas and gas turbine technologies to meet the demand of the developing world will lead to lower emissions as we heard in testimony just last week. It will also meet our paramount interest in assuring national and energy security. Remember, there is no national security without energy security. Unfortunately, the approach taken by this administration seeks an aggressive regulatory agenda and transition away from our energy strengths. The result would be less reliable and affordable energy and an increased reliance on adversarial nations that have little to no environmental or labor standards. As we become weaker, our adversaries become stronger. H.R. 1, the Lower Energy Cost Act, passed by the House earlier this Congress, recognizes this and seeks to restore American energy dominance by increasing domestic energy production, modernizing the permitting process, boosting the production of critical minerals to secure our energy supply chains, and streamlining permitting for energy exports. A key goal of restoring American energy dominance will be to strengthen our nuclear industry and leadership. Of course, nuclear energy is our nation's leading source of emissions-free energy, but is also a critical national security asset. Being a leader in nuclear energy provides us the opportunity to export our nuclear technologies and set global nuclear safety and security norms. If we don't do this, China and Russia, both with robust nuclear programs, surely will do it to the detriment of our national security. So I'm pleased to have introduced the Atomic Energy Advancement Act with my colleague, Ranking Member Dingell. This bill encapsulates the work of many members of this committee on both sides of the aisle and seeks to advance the benefits of nuclear energy by enabling efficient, timely, and predictable licensing, regulation, and deployment of nuclear energy technologies. I'm excited that we're moving forward with this true bipartisan effort to advance nuclear energy in the United States to help position us for success on the global stage. We'll be marking that up today and hopefully get that package to the floor rather quickly. So with that, let me welcome our witnesses today. I look forward to the discussion and how we can advance American energy and our global leadership. With that, I'll yield back and recognize the ranking member DeGette for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. With the start of COP28 last week and international climate negotiations well underway, we must focus on how the United States can continue to lead the world's clean energy transition. That's why I'm glad for this hearing today. As a nation, we've taken tremendous steps in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Investments like the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law are how we must approach energy security, leadership, and environmental stewardship. And we must ensure that we fully fund both transformational laws enacted under the Biden administration. Our actions have improved health and economic outcomes for some of our most disadvantaged communities, while at the same time producing cutting-edge technology and climate solutions for the world. But according to the 5th National Climate Assessment, without even more deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, the risk of intensifying harmful climate impacts will only continue to grow. So how do we do that? There are several ways, but one of the most critical ways is targeting methane emissions. According to the EPA, methane concentrations have more than doubled in the last 2 centuries, largely due to human activity. And as we know, methane is the second largest greenhouse gas contributor to climate change, while also being 28 times more potent than CO2. Thankfully, under the Biden administration, the U.S. continues to lead in the fight against methane emissions. On Saturday at COP, the administration announced new methane regulations to sharply reduce methane and other air pollutants from the oil and gas industry. The rule would prevent an estimated 58 million tons of methane emissions from leaking into our atmosphere from 2024 to 2028. Additionally, the many investments from the Inflation Reduction Act, including the Methane Emissions Reduction Program, affectionately known as MERP, will put the U.S. on track to meet our commitments under the Global Methane Pledge. And so far during COP, in a big diplomatic win, additional countries have already signed on to the Global Methane Pledge. I'm hopeful that these commitments will turn into concrete action because addressing methane emissions is the quickest way to combat climate change and protect public health. Now, as Chairman Duncan mentioned, our subcommittee has worked in a bipartisan manner to move legislation updating the regulation and deployment of nuclear energy, named the Atomic Energy Advancement Act. Nuclear energy is currently responsible for almost half the carbon-free electricity we create here in the U.S. It's part of our clean energy transition toolbox. And already, during COP, the U.S. joined the new Net Zero Nuclear Initiative, which is a commitment to tripling global nuclear capacity by 2050. This bipartisan bill that we hope to mark up this afternoon and get to the floor as quickly as possible, and even has some Senate companionship, can be one of the first steps in supporting this new global commitment. Now, I do not believe that nuclear energy is the so-called silver bullet that will completely solve the climate crisis. We have to ensure that new nuclear reactors are safe and protective of public health, and that we have a strategy to dispose of spent fuel. But the bill we're putting forward takes common sense bipartisan steps to improve the industry while still ensuring our nation's reactors are safe and secure. I've made this point many times in these hearings, but it cannot be overemphasized. Combating the climate crisis requires us to drastically reduce our emissions. Every single report coming out makes this point, and the predominant way to do that is to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. Unfortunately, the majority's proposed partisan solution is the Lower Energy Costs Act, H.R. 1, which is just simply not a viable climate solution. H.R. 1 would increase domestic oil production by 2 million barrels a year and natural gas production by around 10%. If it was viable, the House of Representatives would have transmitted it to the Senate last March when it was passed. But eight months later, it remains in the House. Look, we cannot politicize the urgent necessity to do climate change legislation. And this bill that the chairman and I are doing shows that we can do it in a bipartisan way. So let's stop trying to do messaging and let's start trying to do bipartisan legislating for bills that can go into law. Now, there's disagreement on how we lessen our output of greenhouse gas emissions, but I think we can continue to discuss the importance of U.S. leadership in the supply and delivery of energy, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair will now recognize the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our witnesses. Last week, we examined America's record as a global leader in environmental stewardship, from increasing air quality, cleaner waters, and reducing emissions. Our energy producers and industries have made these achievements possible while increasing our national security, our energy security, and the productive capacity of our nation. This is the message that Energy and Commerce plans to carry to the world stage at COP28. It will be a message about building on America's energy leadership to demonstrate a path to a cleaner, more secure world and more prosperous and resilient communities. Today's hearing is about building upon our successes and making sure America is leading the next era of clean energy and environmental stewardship. We will examine the ingredients of America's success and the lessons for enabling the delivery of affordable, reliable energy to people. We will focus on what matters for people and the security of our nation. What matters for Americans also matters for our allies and people in the developing world. Our leadership and experience can light their path to a prosperous, more secure future, a future that can escape the grip of adversaries like China, Russia, and Iran. The U.S. is blessed with tremendous natural resources, which have been able to harness as a result of free market principles and an environmental spirit that is uniquely American. We've harnessed the power of nuclear energy, electrified millions of rural Americans' homes with clean hydropower, and ushered in the shale revolution, which continues to create millions of new jobs, bring manufacturing back to the U.S., and revitalize communities across the country. America is more energy secure today than ever before, thanks to this legacy, which was built on the foundation of free enterprise, entrepreneurship, and giving people the opportunity to choose which energy sources best suit their needs. Today, we are the #1 producer of oil and natural gas in the world. We've become the top energy exporter, which is helping to shift markets and bolster our security against countries like Russia and Iran. This shale revolution and the affordable and reliable natural gas that American workers are now producing has also enabled America to reduce emissions more than any other nation. We have the capacity to continue helping countries reduce their emissions even further. American energy leadership is critical to ensuring we are not reliant on China, which maintains some of the worst environmental and labor standards in the world. Building on our clean, efficient energy systems can fuel our allies and the world with clean LNG, reducing emissions and increasing reliable energy for those who need it most. Expanding our nuclear technologies and nuclear energy relationships can advance not only the wonderful benefits of nuclear energy, but the strength of new strategic relationships. And demonstrating the value of our free enterprise spirit, built on private capital and initiative, will highlight the path to more secure energy and the promise of human achievement. These features of the American way stand in strong contrast to the misguided goals behind the Rush to Green agenda. I am concerned about EPA's latest steps to advance this agenda with burdensome regulations for methane. These new rules could dramatically expand the agency's regulatory reach in a manner that will stifle innovation, increase operational costs, and increase the price of energy. These burdens will fall directly on American families and businesses, especially on the world stage like at COP28. We must be honest about the reality and the risk of following an energy path in the name of greenhouse gases that seeds American leadership. By all accounts, this rush to green runs right into the control of China, the world's biggest polluter, which would shut down reliable American energy and weaken our security. Energy has been the lifeblood of our modern economy. The introduction of coal, oil, and natural gas over the last several centuries has improved productivity, economic development, and people's standard of living across the world. America's abundant energy resources have empowered people and human potential, resulting in the greatest technological achievements in history. Today, we should talk about what is truly necessary to continue lifting people out of poverty, raising the standard of living, and ensuring energy security. By standing up for American values of free market competition, innovation, and environmental stewardship, we can advance this legacy. Our economy, our national security, the stability of global markets, and the environment will only benefit from continued American leadership. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair will now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the second hearing we've had to examine America's leadership in combating the worsening climate crisis as the 28th United Nations Climate Summit, COP28, continues this week in Dubai. The U.S. continues to show that it's a global leader in reducing emissions and investing in clean energy, and that's especially true over the last couple of years. President Biden and congressional Democrats delivered real climate action last year with the Inflation Reduction Act and its historic $369 billion in critical investments for clean energy and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And these investments are helping us lower costs for American families while growing our economy. The Inflation Reduction Act is expected to create 9 million good-paying American jobs over the next decade. Unfortunately, congressional Republicans oppose the Inflation Reduction Act, and House Republicans have spent this year in the majority pushing policies that put polluters over people. This backward thinking is increasing costs for consumers and weakening America's global competitiveness. Republicans continue to promote fossil fuels over everything else, and they continue to launch attack after attack on the exact clean energy policies that have positioned America to be a leader in reducing emissions and in the transition to a clean energy economy. Whether it's attempting to repeal parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, cancel common-sense money-saving regulations, or launch attacks on efficiency standards that help consumers save money, House Republicans have refused to put forward any meaningful climate solutions. In fact, once this hearing is over, we'll begin a full committee markup this afternoon on several bills that gut energy efficiency standards. And these Republican bills will increase energy costs for American families and halt progress on reducing emissions. That's hardly global energy leadership, and instead continues their push to put polluters over people. Now, while Republicans continue to focus on natural gas and LNG exports, Democrats continue to work with the Biden administration to invest in clean energy and build out domestic manufacturing and growing domestic jobs and building resilient communities. Just this past weekend, EPA announced a final rule that will significantly reduce methane and other pollutants from the oil and natural gas industry. This final rule will prevent an estimated 58 million tons of methane emissions from 2024 to 2038. It also targets harmful air pollutants and is expected to provide a range of health benefits for communities located near oil and gas operations. And even oil and gas executives like the chairman and president of BP are supportive of the final rule, showing that it's possible to make meaningful progress in reducing emissions in a collaborative way. The Biden administration also joined more than 20 other countries in the launch of the Declaration to Triple Nuclear Energy, and these nations committed to working together to triple nuclear energy capacity globally by 2050. The fifth National Climate Assessment, which was released last month, reiterated that we must continue to cut emissions to stave off the worst effects of climate change. And the evidence is all around us. The United States experiences extreme weather events with damages over $1 billion once every 3 weeks. These tragic weather events are happening all over the country, in all of our congressional districts. It's irresponsible to ignore climate change or to pretend like our work here is done. We've made progress over the last couple of years, but our work in combating the worsening climate crisis is far from complete. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and learning how we can build on our emissions reducing efforts. COP28 presents us with an opportunity to show the world that we are leaders and that we are committed to continuing this important work. In order to achieve this, we need to support domestic investments in the clean energy transition, as well as prioritize international cooperation. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now conclude with the members' opening statements. Chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today and taking time to testify before the subcommittee. Each witness will have an opportunity to give an opening statement, followed by a round of questions from our members. All the witnesses, I think, have been here in some capacity before, so welcome back. Dr. Edmund Schweitzer, founder and president of Chief Technology Officer of Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories. Ms. Ann Bradbury, president and CEO of American Exploration and Production Council. Dr. Noah Kaufman, senior research scholar at Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy, and David Gattie, associate professor at the College of Engineering and senior fellow at the Center of International Trade and Security at the University of Georgia. Appreciate you being here today. I'll now recognize Dr. Schweitzer for a 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning, everyone. Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories is part of the 140-year-old electric power industry. It is a legacy stemming from the pioneers including Thomas Edison and Samuel Insull, and advancing to the modern miracle it is today. Electric power is the only commodity that moves at the speed of light. It travels from the Cheers District in Northwest to Southern California in only 6 milliseconds. Because of that miracle, excess solar and wind energy generated during the day can be economically stored behind the dams on the Snake and Columbia rivers and even farther north into Canada for use when it's dark and calm. Electric power moves almost twice as fast as information does in an optical fiber. What a miracle. And so are the public service companies. These regional franchises, also invented by Edison and Insull, operate under the watchful eyes of the state public utility commissions. PS companies were born dedicated to providing safe, reliable, economical service for us all. The electric companies competed with gas companies to provide illumination. At first, electrical illumination cost more than gas. Some customers converted anyway because of safety. No one really wanted an open gas flame to light up their closet. To win more business, the electric companies became more efficient, generating more power with less fuel. Insull frequently reminded folks that capital always gets its pay. Making the best use of capital is essential for shareholders and customers alike. The industry also invented new uses for electricity. Tesla's invention of the induction motor freed millions of Americans from the drudgery of pumping water and washing clothes by hand. The inventions continue. Today's heat pumps can now cool in the summer and heat in the winter and do so efficiently. Regionally franchised PS companies compete with each other. Neighboring utilities built tie lines to share power. These neighbors demanded fair prices of one another, and they knew what fair pricing is because they're in the same business. When you connect, you compete and collaborate to the benefit of customers, shareholders, and the environment. Unfortunately, Enron and others employed sophist arguments to demand deregulation. They wanted to build unregulated power plants, not under the watchful eyes of the PUCs, but where their gas pipelines passed under electric transmission lines to expand their businesses into the electrical sector. Legislators and regulators of both political parties eventually bought the sophists' arguments, resulting in the re-regulation of the industry under FERC 888 and 889, re-regulation that favored Enron's business interests. They're independent generating companies dumping power into the regulated lines treated as the grid, and regulated distribution companies drawing power from the grid as if it were a farmer's vegetable market. None of this makes sense. And what about planning to ensure there's enough electricity when we need it? That used to be handled region by region. A whole new level of governance emerged. Independent system operators and regional transmission operators. Gone was the single responsible entity for the generation, transmission, and distribution supplying electric power to you and me. In the past 30 years, we've seen new regulations, more difficulties permitting, prescriptions and proscriptions, subsidies, mandates and bans, incentives, and other market distorters. We've thrown so much sand in the gears of free enterprise that now we suffer long supply chains reaching all the way to China. What would happen if we take the sand out of the gears? Whether we're D's or R's, we're all plugging into the same wall plugs. It's high time that we unleash the spirit of free enterprise together, the very spirit that made America. Let's free the hundreds of millions of minds to fully embrace our unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we'll lift the heavy burdens from this generation of emerging Edisons and Insuls. Best part is it won't cost the government a dime. Instead, we'll produce tax revenues we can't even imagine today to pay down our debts. Our 100% employee-owned company is succeeding by inventing the future without turning to government for subsidy or mandate. We urge you and all of your colleagues representing us to ensure a fair, free, flat, and open environment for every individual in America. Believe in the Constitution, believe in America. I do. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Bradbury, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Make sure your mic is on there. Is the button pushed?
Thank you. Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member DeGette, Chair Rogers, and Ranking Member Pallone, distinguished members of the committee, thank you so much for the invitation to speak here today on behalf of AXPC. AXPC represents the leading independent producers of oil and natural gas who brought this country from a place of energy scarcity to energy abundance, shepherding in the last decade of American energy leadership on the global stage. You've chosen an incredibly important topic for today's hearing. How can America, building on our past achievements, lead a new era of energy dominance, security, and environmental stewardship? Fortunately, we are well poised to do so. Our nation is already blessed with a wealth of natural resources, human resources, innovation, and know-how necessary to build that future. The American oil and gas industry looks forward to continuing to play our part. One thing is certain, the need for oil and natural gas is not going away. Demand is skyrocketing as the global middle class expands. Access to reliable, secure, and affordable energy, exactly the kind that oil and natural gas provide, is the #1 indicator of human progress. The question is not whether the world will continue to use oil and gas, but rather whose oil and gas will the world be using. There is an enormous difference between the safe and efficient oil and natural gas produced in our country and what is produced in many other nations. Providing these resources to the world is an environmental, economic, and security opportunity for America. U.S. LNG, made plentiful by the shale revolution, may be one of the greatest environmental breakthroughs of the last century. If we want to help make a dent in global emissions, exporting more U.S. LNG should be a top priority. Of course, there's always room for further improvement, and our industry is leading in the investment and innovation required to further lower emissions from oil and natural gas from the wellhead to the end user. In the past decade, we have dramatically increased the efficiency of our operations. Today, companies produce exponentially more from a single location and do so in less time, with less footprint, and less impact on the environment. American energy innovations are also being used to produce some of the cleanest oil and gas molecules in the world. Innovations such as fixed sensors, lasers, specialized cameras mounted to drones or aircraft and satellites are enabling companies today to better understand and mitigate emissions over broader areas, finding leaks faster so they can be eliminated. According to the Global Methane Tracker, U.S. oil and natural gas production has one of the lowest methane intensities in the world. Only 7 other producing nations have a slightly lower methane intensity, and the U.S. produces more oil and natural gas than all 7 of those nations combined. If the U.S. winds down production, another country will fill the supply gap, likely with a much higher emissions intensity. And our innovation also reaches well beyond our own operations, aiming to tackle emissions from hard-to-abate sectors such as commercial transportation, heavy industry, and power generation. It is these sectors that drive 80% of global carbon emissions. We're investing in cutting-edge technologies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, low-carbon hydrogen, and geothermal energy, which relies on advanced drilling and fracking techniques pioneered by our industry. Scaling up these technologies and driving down their costs will rely on a scale of engineering, capital, and project management capabilities that match those of large oil and gas companies. Our discussion today touches on many facets of America's global energy leadership, and appropriately so. American-made energy is a security advantage for us and our allies, and that's particularly true during this time of geopolitical chaos. Because of American energy dominance, the American people are more secure and the world is more stable. The energy production of today is largely a result of industry's innovations and the energy policies of previous administrations. Climate policy, energy policy, and foreign policy are inextricably linked, and we must work collectively to get each right in order to maintain and build on the energy dominance that we have worked so hard to achieve. AXPC members join you in a shared commitment to tackling those twin challenges of reducing emissions and meeting global growing energy demand. We have been hard at work on that mission for years, and we've only just begun. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Bradbury. Now, Dr. Kaufman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name's Noah Kaufman. I'm an economist. My testimony will make 3 points. First, there's been dramatic changes in the economics of the energy transition. Second, recent laws will help Americans navigate the energy transition. And third, we need strong international cooperation to take advantage of the improving economics of clean energy. To the first point, a decade ago, about 60% of new electricity capacity in this country was from fossil fuels. Last year, about 70% of new capacities was from carbon-free sources, including renewables and nuclear. Globally, this percentage is even higher. Vehicles may be next. 2 of the 3 most valuable automakers in the world produce only electric vehicles. Even legacy automaker investments are disproportionately electric. We are living in interesting times. Energy systems remain heavily fossil intensive today, but when most of the new stuff we're building is clean, an energy transition becomes almost inevitable. These changes have profound implications for economic policy. Previously, countries may have justified inaction due to the risks of an energy transition. Today, there is clearly no safe status quo option. Which brings me to my second point about the host of recent actions that Congress have taken. These laws will reduce emissions. That'll save lives, make people healthier and more productive. Just as importantly, they will help American workers and communities navigate the energy transition. We are global leading producers of carbon-intensive products. Cleaner technologies and fuels are now gaining economic importance. We were essentially seeding markets for rapidly growing technologies like batteries to producers in China and other countries. Recent actions of Congress have given American producers a fighting chance to compete. The most salient risks of the energy transition are at local levels. Communities across this country are heavily dependent on carbon-intensive industries for jobs and public revenues. A net zero strategy that works for the whole country needs to be paired with robust support for these communities. Recent laws start to do this. They will fund remediation projects at old mines and wells. They will help fund many clean energy projects in these communities. These are only first steps. Communities need holistic economic development strategies. Clean energy may often play just a small role. Even the petrostates in the Middle East recognize the importance of economic diversification. Dubai is an example. Declining oil reserves forced the emirate to shift away from its reliance on oil, and Dubai has become a financial and tourist hub and an international city that hosts events like the ongoing climate change conference, COP28. And that segues to my third point. The international community has applauded the United States for its growing climate ambition. But countries have also expressed deep concerns about the large support in recent laws for US producers. These measures have exacerbated the severe geopolitical tensions that surround energy access and the energy transition. Trade disputes raise prices for consumers, they limit export markets for producers, and they slow innovation. Fortunately, actions that support domestic producers and encourage strong international cooperation are not necessarily mutually exclusive. I'll give you two examples. First, we need broad multilateral agreements to decarbonize internationally traded products like steel. These agreements must be compatible with the industrial strategies of richer countries and also the development goals of lower-income countries like India, where most future emissions will occur. The agreement to phase out HFCs with the Kigali Amendment provides a useful template, and it received bipartisan support in the Senate last year. A second priority is a modernized set of international trade rules. The current World Trade Organization is not a credible arbiter for disputes related to the energy transition. Revised rules can reaffirm the importance of low trade barriers while clearly recognizing the need to support communities, to nurture emerging industries, and to ensure energy security. These actions can benefit U.S. producers, but they will not happen without the strong leadership of the U.S. government. I'll conclude by emphasizing that energy transition policies come with trade-offs. How do we ensure low costs for consumers and high-paying jobs for workers? How do we make the transition sufficiently smooth for communities, yet sufficiently rapid to protect the often vulnerable and voiceless people who will suffer the most from climate damages? My suggestion is to work together on solutions that address these trade-offs head-on. There are no perfect solutions, but given the rapidly changing economics of the energy transition, inaction would be a disservice to Americans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kaufman. Now, Dr. Gattie, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Duncan and Ranking Member Dingell, for the opportunity to testify this morning. You've heard testimony that the U.S. has reduced carbon emissions for the past 20 years. I've included 2 papers along with figures and data that align with those conclusions. So in my opening remarks, I'd like to address what I believe to be one of the most direct and acute impacts an energy transition policy could have on our national security. It revolves around a central point, that being the imperative that we secure an industrial base and energy resource advantage over our 21st century strategic competitors, particularly China. America's industrial base was built on a diverse energy portfolio of fossil fuels, nuclear, and renewables, and that industrial base is the platform from which the U.S. projects national power globally. America dominated the 20th century in large part because of our industrial capacity relative to other powers, specifically the Soviet Union. We were in this position because all past U.S. energy transitions were cumulative. Domestic resources were added and diversity increased. With this came flexibility, resilience, and reliability, all of which translated to our national security and opportunities for global partnerships with emerging economies. We've learned that energy resources have different value propositions in an economy. Fossil fuels are stored primary energy resources with high heating values that are necessary for industrial processes. They can be transported to where demand is greatest and deployed when called on. Nuclear power is a baseload 24/7 resource with 0 carbon emissions. These are intrinsically different value propositions compared with intermittent renewables, which are not transportable, callable, or 24/7. Renewables should be included in a diverse energy portfolio, but not as a replacement resource, as they won't deliver the same value to America's industrial base as fossil fuels or nuclear. Emerging economies and our competitors know this. This is important as the battle for hearts and minds is a core objective in great power competition, and the outcome will be affected by the decisions of weaker powers. Great powers compete, but weaker powers may ultimately determine who wins. This said, it's a matter of national security that U.S. energy policy account for the energy needs of emerging economies in need of proven, reliable energy resources. The world will consume oil and natural gas, and it's going to build nuclear reactors, with us or without us. Better that it be with us than with our strategic competitors who would welcome the opportunity. I want to make a particular comment about nuclear power, which is becoming increasingly bipartisan, and that's very encouraging. America once had a special relationship with nuclear power as a national security imperative, the original principle on which nuclear power was founded. Currently, however, it's being treated as just another market commodity or technology for carbon reduction. I invite the members to read the paper I've included in my testimony on national security as a value-added proposition for nuclear power. In closing, America's economy, our industrial base, our military, our system of self-governance, our global network of alliances, and our global security guarantees is the most sweeping success story of democracy and individual liberty in human history. It also arguably is the most complex system on earth. As such, forcing this system to restructure itself with pledges to reduce carbon emissions by predetermined dates constitutes a systemic change that will be fraught with unintended consequences. Our current national security strategy is clear. While Russia constitutes an immediate and acute threat, the PRC, by contrast, is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to advance that objective. To this end, China is expanding its industrial base with all energy resources and all energy technologies, and they're establishing long-term partnerships with energy-rich nations. It is building a deep, diverse industrial base from which to project power and challenge the U.S. Moreover, China has openly declared its principle of building the new before discarding the old. China will not jeopardize its geopolitical objectives in order to address climate change. As such, a core national security concern for any proposed U.S. energy transition should be this: can the U.S., with its industrial base restructured around low and zero carbon energy, retain its 20th century economic, military, industrial, and geopolitical advantage relative to 21st century strategic competitors and outcompete China and deny the CCP of its intentions to disrupt a rules-based international order? Our energy legacy tells us that we can rise up to this 21st century strategic challenge with all energy resources and technologies in our industrial base. To attempt otherwise will constitute a grand experiment on the most important industrialized nation in the world at a time of unprecedented challenges to freedom and liberty. I look forward to your questions.
I want to thank all of you for your testimony. Great foundation as we go into the question and answer portion of this hearing. I'll now begin the questioning, recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Bradbury, the shale revolution has been foundational for our energy security and our economy for over the past 15 years. Jobs have been created in all 50 states, billions of dollars that would have gone to OPEC and Russia stayed here in our economy, and tax revenues have helped fund infrastructure, hospitals, and schools. So we know the benefits. You also know that prior to 2007 or so, the true impact of the shale revolution was not fully appreciated. Many policy advocates were talking about peak oil at the time. Can you speak a bit to the role of innovation in our free enterprise system in the story of this energy revolution?
Thank you, Chairman Duncan, for your question and for your support of American energy. That's a great question. As you point out, in the early 2000s, people believed that American energy production was declining. But as a result of the innovations from this industry, as well as the foundation of free enterprise, our abundant natural resources, and our underlying foundation of contract law and rule of law, kicked off what we now call the American energy revolution. This was driven by the incredible innovation of the industry. And I will note that this was not just a moment in time, that this innovation continues today, that the industry continues to innovate to both find additional efficiencies in the production of oil and natural gas. They're now drilling wells miles under the surface, which really reduces surface impact, and continuing to innovate to produce ever cleaner energy. So innovation, free enterprise is really the driving force behind the great American energy revolution.
Yeah, you know, there's some confusion sometimes that mandates and regulations drive innovation rather than respond to innovation. Ms. Bradbury, were the EPA and climate policies responsible for the development of the resources in Marcellus, Utica, or Permian Basin?
I would not say the regulations were responsible for those innovations.
Thank you for that. From your perspective, should we be building on our energy successes?
I believe we should be building on energy successes.
How will that promote cleaner technology and benefits to the world?
I'm sorry?
How will that benefit, promote cleaner technology and benefit the world?
Absolutely. A healthy American energy sector is good for the world. It not only produces abundant energy here at home, but it incentivizes the technology development that can be used to produce ever cleaner energy at home, and then to export that technology around the globe to help our allies in producing regions to help drive down emissions as well.
Absolutely. Mr. Gattie, you've noted that a hallmark of America's energy and national security legacy is an abundant domestic supply of diverse energy resources. These provide the flexibility and resilience in times of economic disruption, geopolitical turmoil, something Europe has witnessed firsthand since Russia's Ukraine invasion. Would you agree we should preserve the security benefits of American energy as we develop policies to address climate risk?
Yes, Chair, I would agree, and I think that diversity aspect is one that's critical as far as moving forward in the country. Again, it provides us with flexibility and options. We could ask the question, in fact, we could ask Europe right now, just where they would be if we were not a diverse nation with plenty of natural gas that we could ship there. I think Europe would probably give us a pretty good answer of the importance of that. But domestically, it's going to underpin our industrial base, the fact that we have a diverse supply, flexibility, options, so that we can respond to catastrophes and emergencies, domestic and abroad. We're going to need those resources.
We've allowed our nuclear leadership to atrophy, but we're working to realign our policies to meet the vision of the Atomic Energy Act, which helped launch the nuclear age. We'll be marking up a package you heard earlier. We'll do that later today. Nuclear energy has a role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but a central role in a future national security framework should add extra urgency to getting our policies right. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I would agree, and I would really like to see us prioritize nuclear power, Chair Duncan, that we elevate this to the national security level that it was originally intended, really back in the 1950s. We understood that.
Yeah.
We were talking about long-term energy relationships here that extend 80 years.
If we don't do that, if we don't advance our nuclear technology, and who fills that void, Dr.
Well,
Gattie?
I think we can look at the construction starts currently. China and Russia already are deploying those, and they're exporting them.
Yeah, it's time for America to reclaim its leadership in that. With that, I will now recognize the ranking member DeGette for 5 minutes for questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So, Dr. Kaufman, I want to ask you a few questions. Last year, the United States invested $39 billion in clean energy manufacturing. Is that right?
That sounds right. About $39 billion in clean energy manufacturing was invested in the United States, and that's something like double
Right.
the previous year.
And in your testimony, you mentioned that the laws investing this money allow American producers a chance to compete in international markets. Is that right?
Yes.
And how does that investment support American producers' competitiveness in those markets? How's that happen?
Well, it happens because, there's two main reasons. First of all, you just have a lot of, what economists would call market failures, preventing early stage innovation in key technologies if you don't have government support. So you have plenty of other countries, regions like Europe, that are providing that support.
Like China too, right?
China too, and that's the second point I was going to make, is that even beyond the market failures, you have a lot of countries that are, putting a lot of emphasis on supporting their own domestic industries.
So to that end, investments from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act are duly supportive of industry competitiveness as well as climate goals. I want to also ask you, Dr. Kaufman, global carbon dioxide emissions actually increased last year, didn't they?
Yes.
How would these two laws I just referenced assist in decreasing carbon emissions?
That was the infrastructure bill and the Inflation
That's
Reduction.
correct.
Well, so they do it by further changing the economics of clean energy. So the infrastructure bill, it's in the name. It helps facilitate the infrastructure that you need to deploy clean energy faster and cheaper. And then the Inflation Reduction Act has, a host of different measures that directly change the economics of the cleaner versus the dirtier options.
Great.
Again, addressing very well-known market failures.
Thanks. The IRA also invests in domestic programs like the Methane Emissions Reduction Program, which support the U.S. in meeting the global methane pledge to reduce emissions by at least 30% by 2030. And as I said in my opening statement, additional countries are signing on to the global methane pledge at COP. So Dr. Kaufman, is there a way for the U.S. as a leader in reducing emissions to help support action on those commitments at COP?
I think it's very important that we announced our recent methane rules alongside other countries at COP, because climate change is a global problem, as I think many of us have recognized. So no single country's actions alone are going to make the difference.
It has to be global. And the U.S. can lead, right?
Not only can we lead, I think it's very unlikely that we'll see the sort of strong international cooperation if global leadership isn't prioritized by the U.S. government.
So, Ms. Bradbury, I just want to kind of follow that up with a question to you, because you point out in your written testimony that the United States actually is a leader on methane emission right now. Is that right?
That is correct.
And one of the reasons is because if you can capture that methane during drilling, it actually can be an economic benefit to the company. Isn't that right?
Methane is the primary ingredient in natural gas, which
Right.
is one of our commodities.
But so if you can capture that, not let it out into the atmosphere, it's a win-win, because it has a financial benefit and also an environmental benefit. Isn't that correct?
That is correct,
Yeah.
that natural gas is a commodity, yes.
Yeah, and that's why I've been working on trying to figure out ways to capture methane for years, because I think it should be an incentive for producers to do that as well. I just have one more question for you, because I listened to your testimony and I also read your testimony. I think even among the oil and gas producers, who are the folks who you work for, there's a recognition that we need to reduce emissions and that we need to seriously address climate change. Isn't that correct?
I would say that is correct.
And one thing that, at least when I talk to the producers in Colorado and throughout the West, they really appreciate not having clear, they appreciate having clear standards to which they have to adhere, not ever shifting rules and regulations. Wouldn't that be a fair statement?
That is a fair statement, that industry supports understanding the rules of the road. I will also note that Colorado did a great job of working with their producers to develop those standards in Colorado.
You are totally right. Thank you for the commercial for Colorado. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Ranking Member. Point of personal privilege, I would just ask all of you to help me thank my current Chief of Staff, who's leaving at the end of the week. He's also a shared employee on Energy and Commerce. Alan Klump's been with me for 15 years. And Alan, thanks for your service to our country, our state, and to this committee. So thank you, guys. Thank you for that. I'll now recognize the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes.
America must lead a new era of energy dominance, security, and environmental stewardship. This example requires focus on the principles and values that have long enabled American innovation, productivity, and prosperity. Dr. Schweitzer, I'm thankful that you're here today to celebrate how Eastern Washington is leading the way. Now a commercial for Eastern Washington. You tell the story of electricity, the miracle of electricity. And it is truly it's an American story of innovation and market competition that works to the benefit of all, including environmental stewardship. You also tell us about misguided regulations, permitting challenges, subsidies, mandates, and bans, and other market distortions. Today, electric rates have been rising. Reliability is declining, which is the opposite of what we should expect from our free enterprise system. So, Dr. Schweitzer, is picking winners and losers through regulation and subsidy the right course?
I don't think that government is capable of choosing winners and losers. It seems that so many of the subsidies end up to subsidize losers and losers. that it's no substitute, despite everybody's best efforts, it's no substitute for the power of the free markets.
Thank you. How do you take the sand out of the gears of our free enterprise system? And if we don't take the sand out of the gears, won't we lose our security to China?
There's no question about it that we are turning off reliable assets for generating power in this country and trying to substitute intermittent sources such as solar panels made with predominantly Chinese resources. And that's a dependence that should not continue to progress. I'm delighted to hear many of you on both sides talk in favor of nuclear power. That is the answer. And I hope that things go well in your markup this afternoon from both sides.
Thank you. Dr. Gattie, welcome back to the committee. Your testimony argues for putting national security back at the center of energy policy, including our climate-related policies. China's government-driven industrial growth is formidable. Would you say that this poses clear threats to our national security and our role in the world? And why should we account for the energy needs of emerging economies which want proven reliable sources like fossil fuel and nuclear?
Thank you for the question, Chair Rogers. Yes, China's a threat. And again, my focus, and this is what I really hope that I can bring to the members, that this is about our industrial base. And I'm not talking about just our defense industrial base, but I'm talking about the country's industrial base. China's industrial base is getting broader, deeper, more flexible, more options. They are every energy resource and technology known to civilization. We can ask ourselves the question, in the end, whose industrial base wins the competition? The diverse industrial base with combustion and flames in it, or the one that's built around decarbonization and renewables dominantly? The weaker powers now, they're going to choose partners. They need energy. Everyone's testified to that. That is as known as any fact we've got in the committee. They're going to choose partners. They're looking for partners. They really prefer us. We're just not giving them the option right now if we're going to cut fossil fuels off.
Thank you. Ms. Bradbury, can America's oil and gas industry deliver energy and deliver it cleaner than anybody else?
Thank you for the question, Chair Rogers. I would say it can and it is. The U.S. is already the world leader in producing oil and gas. We're currently at record levels of production. When you look at the additional barrels that are getting put on the global market today, the vast majority of those are American sources. And again, we continue to deliver that oil and gas under some of the highest standards and lowest emissions in the world.
I've asked this in other hearings. Increasing people's capacity to thrive and prosper is a good thing, whether in America or around the world. So as a follow-up, if we build on our shale revolution and export more of our energy, our technology, and our know-how, will that help or harm people?
Unquestionably help. You know, we in America are incredibly fortunate to have this abundant, affordable energy available to us 24/7, 365 days a year. There are 3.5 billion people in the world who don't have access to reliable energy. There are almost 1 billion people in the world who have no access to energy. And there are billions of people in the world for whom energy is unaffordable. And so energy is a necessary prerequisite to lifting people out of poverty and raising standards of living around the globe. And American energy is the differential for billions of people around the world who are looking for that upward mobility.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I yield back.
Generally yields back. I now go to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are of Dr. Kaufman. As you mentioned in your testimony, the energy transition is well underway. However, according to the 5th National Climate Assessment, we must continue to cut emissions to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So can you please elaborate on how American leadership, such as investments made in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, plays an important role in helping us reduce emissions and avoid the worst effects of climate change?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And, you know, it's a global problem, but the United States is so important to global decarbonization that you're just not going to see decarbonization that really confronts the risks of climate change if the United States doesn't act. And I do think the actions of Congress over the last few years took us from a place where annual emissions may not have even been falling anymore throughout the rest of this decade, to certainly a lot of downward pressure on emissions, and we'll see where they go. I guess one other thing I'll add is that it sounds like we all agree here on the importance of ensuring national security, energy security, reliability, economic growth. And just from my perspective, there's nothing inconsistent with achieving those goals and at the same time rapidly reducing our greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, House Republicans have spent their time in the majority working to repeal large parts of these landmark laws, including the critical greenhouse gas reduction fund and even tax credits for nuclear power. So, Dr. Kaufman, how do the investments from these laws compare to investments other countries have made to reduce emissions?
Well, in some ways, we've jumped ahead of some countries in the last couple of years. I would say in terms of policy measures to support clean energy and to reduce emissions, the United States was a laggard for a long time, and that's how we were seen in the international community. I mean, we're the country that is most responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that are in the atmosphere from the last couple centuries, and then the actions this Congress has taken over the last couple of years has really put us on par, at least, with some of the global leading countries taking steps towards reducing their emissions.
And then, I mean, obviously, America has been a leader in reducing emissions and investing in the clean energy transition. But my concern here is that Republicans, if they have their way, will keep chipping away at this American leadership. So, Dr. Kaufman, with most of the world transitioning to clean energy, what do we lose by doubling down on fossil fuels? Can you elaborate on the economic costs of not prioritizing clean energy development?
Sure. I mean, I think it's, more than anything, it's a risk management strategy for our economy, right? As I mentioned in my testimony, you see sort of undeniably there's a growing importance of clean energy technologies and supply chains around the world. And certainly countries like China have a big advantage in some of these markets, like batteries, like production of solar. Dr. Gattie mentioned the advantage in nuclear. I think some of the measures Congress has taken, I don't see them so much as picking winners as giving American producers just the opportunity to compete in these global markets if they can earn it.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm just concerned that if we don't prioritize the clean energy transition, we face increasing greenhouse gas emissions and mounting climate disasters, which we see all the time here. But we also risk watching other countries taking the lead and benefiting from the enormous economic opportunities found in clean energy. So I just hope my colleagues across the aisle join us in fighting for continued investments in the energy transition, because I do think it's so important in so many ways. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now recognize gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. This is an important topic and discussion, and it deserves more than slogans, I guess, people use politically, things like polluters over people. I think that's just below the dignity of this hearing you're having today, and I will tell you what we have is for the people. We want people to have sustainable, affordable, and reliable energy. That's important because the people at the lowest end of the economic spectrum is more greatly affected. And I'll say that I'm just kind of got me off on a tangent, but I'm going to go on it a little bit. I'm reading the Robert Caro series on the years of Lyndon Johnson, and he talks about when Lyndon Johnson was part of this body, one of his big accomplishments was bringing electricity to the hill country of Texas. And to set up how important that was, he goes on for 20 or 25 pages about what life was like for people in the hill country. Now, I know it's a big tourist area, but it wasn't at the time of Lyndon Johnson. It was poverty and what life was like. And I'm reading that. I knew my great-grandmother. She was born in 1894, died in 1980 when I was 16, so I knew her well. She was not from the hill country. She was from where the Natchez Trace crossed into Alabama on the Tennessee side, but I can tell you the poverty was just as extreme there. That's why the Tennessee Valley Authority came and changed their lives. And I'm reading this. She was probably in her 30s or almost 40s when electricity came. So she had to, Dr. Schweitzer, you talked about it, hand-wash clothes, canned everything because there's no refrigeration. It just, and if you think about it, she was born at the time the Biltmore Mansion was opened. And I can tell you, George Vanderbilt didn't have to worry about electricity because when he walked in the room, somebody lit the lamp. When he took off his clothes, somebody took them out and washed them. What it did, it really improved the lives of people at the lowest end of the economic spectrum. That's what we're talking about, what affordable energy does. I can tell you, I have a good friend who's 96-year-old lady, and she decides when she drives or doesn't drive based on what the gas prices are in Bowling Green, Kentucky, weekly. I mean, she really does. She really makes those decisions. And so what we do here affects people. It really affects people, and and it affects on an international level. I was with somebody that definitely speaks at the high levels for the German government, and he said, if you want peace, produce gas. And somebody made the comment to that person and said, well, I understand that Germany has all of the liquid natural gas their docks can contain. And this person said, well, sell it on the world market. We want the price to come down. If you think about it, the White House is asking for, and I believe we should support Ukraine, but the White House is asking for supplemental appropriation to support Ukraine. If you think about it, because we don't drill for gas, the price of natural gas is high throughout the world. They buy it from Russia. We're funding Russia's army by our environmental policy, by our energy policy. We're sending money to Ukraine to fight an army that only exists because we don't drill for gas. It's that simple. It really is that simple. And so, Dr. Gattie, I just want to ask you, would you expand on the importance of putting American energy and export of American energy into the national security debate?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Again, I want to take us back again to the preeminence of what the country was built on. The country was built on diverse domestic energy supplies, coal, oil, gas, nuclear, and renewables. That is a position, and I know the word dominance is used, maybe perhaps it's overused, but it is still a relevant term today, that we need to operate from a position of advantage relative primarily to our competitors, but also an advantage that allows us to serve other countries. So that position of it's an advantage, but it's a position of relevance. We can imagine if the U.S. disengages from the global network, the global energy network, what voice do we have at that point in decisions that are made globally, including the climate discussion?
I'm about out of time, so thank you for that. And it is important that we focus on continuing to be the world leader in dropping emissions. People need to understand that's where America is, the world leader in dropping emissions. So, Ms. Bradbury or Dr. Schweitzer, can you describe how innovation like the shale revolution is going to do this quicker than any government top-down regulation? Mr. Bradbury, you can. Fellow Louisville, not a fellow Louisville, a fellow Kentuckian.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. And I would also actually like to just jump on a point that you made earlier, and that is the importance of production in our economic growth. Because of the shale revolution, prices of energy, household energy costs dropped in the United States by 10%, while costs of healthcare and education skyrocketed in 30-40% over the last 10 years. So it is foundational to our economy that we have abundant energy to keep prices low. And then that same energy sector is able to invest in emissions reductions technology that also ensure that we are producing the cleanest and most affordable energy in the world.
Thanks. I'm sorry my time has expired, and I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and I'll go to California. Mr. Peters for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, Ms. Bradbury, Olive Branch. You must be very frustrated or amused sometimes at people who drive their cars in here to work and then talk about getting rid of oil and gas. And I'm not going to be one of those people, and I'm also not going to deny what Mr. Guthrie just said, which is natural gas burns cleaner than coal. If it was up to me, we'd never burn another spoonful of coal. That's why I've always been talking about methane. And the thing that's obvious to me from this discussion already is that we should be agreeing on methane here, okay? The industry has described how they're leading in the reduction of methane emissions, and it's not because of Joe Biden's rush to green agenda. It's because of customer demand. It's because Korea and Japan and Europe have demanded clean gas. And as a result of that, the industry has developed, to your total credit, I'm happy this happened, new technologies for monitoring methane that not just don't just identify the presence of methane, but the concentration of methane from the air and from the ground, and it has given new attention to actually preventing the release of methane into the atmosphere. And that's important because, as I said before, methane emissions are 80 times more potent in the short run than CO2 and can cause about 25 to 2,000 times more warming per ton over a 25 to 100-year period. And that's happened before these regulations that were announced this week even went into effect. So kudos to the industry for actually giving attention to that, maybe driven by customer demand, and for taking it upon yourselves to really come up with this attention to methane that I think is all good for everyone. And I want to thank you for that. I think it's great. It's because of that, by the way, but there is a point at which that's not enough. And the problem is that as good as many of your actors are, and as attuned as they are to the demands around the world for clean gas, not everyone is. And that's why the other thing I've advocated is that we need to go the next step as a government to say that everyone's got to be on the methane train. Everyone's got to be controlling methane, not just the ones who are not operating close to the margin, because we know that there's those independent operators, I've heard about it from my friends in West Texas, that are on the margins that aren't going to make those investments. So first of all, as a matter of environmental integrity, I think we need everyone to be on the board, but also as a matter of competition, it's not fair for one person to be taking these actions and someone down the street not be able to do that. That's the role of the government. That's why I'm happy that we had this announcement in Dubai about cutting-edge methane detection and control. The EPA estimates that the rule will prevent an estimated 58 million tons of methane emissions from 24 to 2038, nearly 80% reduction in methane emissions from what would otherwise be in the air without the rule. We should agree on that at the beginning of the day. I think oil and gas can be around for a long time. And I don't know how California or Germany replaces the nuclear that we took out without oil and gas. In the short run, we can't do it. We don't have enough batteries. There's supply chain challenges with that. There's going to be a period of transition of time. So I'd ask everyone in the room, let's not lose sight of making sure that what we're using today is as clean as possible. And we're on the track, but we have to take the next step. And that's why it still concerns me that my Republican colleagues are talking about eliminating rules on methane. I just think that that's not possible. And I think it's an area where we can agree. It's the minimum thing we can do. It's the low-hanging fruit, and it's a total win. So thank you for developing the technology that makes it possible for us to do that. Thanks for doing what you've done on your own. I think it's up to us to take the next step. The other place where I don't think that our interests necessarily converge in oil and gas is that we have to have a more diversified energy system to be more secure. It's not Ms. Bradbury's job to sell nuclear or solar and wind. It's not her job to set up a transmission system that supports all kinds of energy. That's our job, and that's why we have to take the next step. But I don't want to miss the chance to point out that the oil and gas industry is doing a lot of what my Republican colleagues say we don't need to do, and it's doing it without a rush to green drive from the Biden administration. Dr. Kaufman, I just want you to address one other thing in the short period of time I've left. The inevitability of this transition apart from the United States. Talk about this. If this so-called rush to green thing weren't happening in the United States, would there still be an energy transition?
I mean, it's early days, but it certainly looks, when you look at these key sectors that I mentioned, in electricity, in vehicles, and some of the innovations that we're seeing across other sectors, there's a transition that is happening. The question is how fast, right? And I think that depends on a lot of different factors, including how serious we are about climate.
My time's expired, but if we also want to lead it, we're going to make the innovations, we're going to get the economic return in the United States, and I think we should be at the lead, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, who is chair of the Environmental Subcommittee. Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bradbury, let me start with you. First of all, thanks for all that you do, especially representing smaller and mid-sized producers in my district and across the Marcellus and Utica Shale. I'm sorry, Miss Bradbury. Bradbury, I said Mr. I got that wrong. But all that you do to represent the small and mid-sized producers in my district. I want to ask you some questions in regards to liquefied natural gas, and I appreciate AXPC's support of my legislation, the Unlocking Our Domestic LNG Potential Act. We still want to get that over the finish line this year. As you mentioned in your testimony, American LNG exports strengthens our geopolitical position while reducing global emissions in an increasingly energy-hungry world. Energy demand is going up, and the only question is who's going to provide it. Russia, also a major gas producer, knows this. It's been widely reported that Russia and others are bankrolling and pushing anti-American natural gas ideas in the West. The COP Climate Conference is this week, and I'm sure that many green NGOs, as they are called, will be active there in disparaging America's clean, abundant natural resources. So, Ms. Bradbury, can you describe the damage that Russia's smear campaigns and tactics cause to the reputation of U.S. natural gas abroad?
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for that question. And thank you for your leadership in regard to U.S. energy, especially with some of our Ohio producers at home. So first I'll say that the Russian campaign against quote-unquote fracked gas or American natural gas is well documented by intelligence officials of both sides going back well over a decade. It I think highlights the intersection of energy security, national security, and economic security. And Putin clearly recognized that American energy production is a threat to Russian interests. And I think today we can see why he thought that. Because we know that Mr. Putin has been weaponizing Russia's energy resources to fund their invasion of Ukraine and against our allies in Europe.
Can you quickly then provide, let me give you an opportunity to briefly discredit this misinformation, flip to talking about how the U.S. produces the cleanest natural gas in the world.
Certainly. So the U.S. produces among the cleanest natural gas in the world, and multiple independent studies have shown that U.S. LNG is somewhere between 10 and 40% lower emissions than Russian gas piped to Europe.
Okay, all right. Let me pivot. I want to mention an encouraging development for our full committee markup this afternoon. I'm encouraged by the inclusion of my Strengthening American Nuclear Competitiveness Act as part of the broader bipartisan nuclear package we want to take to the House floor. My legislation streamlines the export of U.S. nuclear energy technologies while bolstering American civilian nuclear competitiveness in the global market. Globally, Russia leads the number of exports with about half of the 53 units under construction around the world today. And modernizing our export process, leveraging investments from our allies and determining how the U.S. can better compete globally is necessary to ensure that the U.S. remains a global leader in nuclear technology. So, Mr. Gattie, can you speak to the importance of American leadership in the global nuclear energy market?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, sir. We've always led. We have been the leaders since the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And, the developing economies are looking for that leadership again. They don't want to choose Russia. They don't want to choose China. They want to choose the U.S. I think it's imperative for us here in the U.S. to look at getting our supply chain, as you point out, Congressman, with our allies on board to essentially conduct a nuclear industrial base review to see what it's going to take for us to be competitive again,
Sure.
to regain that.
How can the U.S. become cost competitive with countries like China and Russia in the nuclear export market? I mean, they give out, interest-free loans. Basically, they understand get the camel's nose in the tent and the rest of the camels coming through too. So how can we become more cost competitive?
Well, first, I think we're going to have to get past the non-recurring engineering phase of this. We actually are just doing one-offs for nuclear power production in the U.S. We've got to get a demand signal out there, Congressman, that's going to give us a book of business so that we can come down that cost. It's going to take time, but it's going to also take prioritizing it here in D.C. and in states.
Okay, all right. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'll now go to Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Dr. Kaufman, what does the phrase place-based policy or place-based industrial strategy mean?
Well, it recognizes the fact that, number one, if you're talking about place-based policies with respect to our energy and climate challenges, I mean, I think that number one recognition is that if we're serious about climate change, that means we need to rapidly reduce our emissions. We could argue about the date, but we need to drive down emissions in this country. And it's a recognition that fossil fuel production and the production of carbon-intensive projects are very geographically concentrated in the country. So we have communities that are just dependent, not just for jobs, but for public services. They're dependent on these industries. So a place-based strategy recognizes that, and it emphasizes the importance of building prosperity and resilient economies in specific places.
Thank you. And so is the idea that there can be intentionality and cooperation between the public and private sectors when determining where and how to make investments?
Sure. I mean, I think that there has to be cooperation, and I think designing strategies that incentivize. I mean, the real issue is that if you have dominant industries or employers in a certain place, if they start leaving, communities can get into these downward spirals, right, where they have trouble attracting new industries or retaining the ones that are already there. So what I think the role of the government is to figure out the right incentives to counteract those forces and to protect the people who want to stay in their communities.
Okay, so for the revitalization of communities that may be included in that thought, that are struggling today or are expected to have challenges with the energy transition, would fossil fuel dependent communities and deindustrialized communities fit that mold?
They definitely fit in that mode, yes.
Okay, so, as an example, I would look to the Appalachian Regional Commission. Now we are talking about dramatically reordering our national economy and energy system, so of course these efforts need to be supercharged. So Dr. Kaufman, as the Biden administration has worked to implement recently enacted historic laws like the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, is this a strategy that has been consciously adopted by the administration to make certain that all communities have the opportunity to benefit in this clean energy transition?
It has. It's a major focus of the administration's economic and climate policy. And I would say it's really the first time, at least in our country, we've seen sort of a large-scale effort at place-based policy, which that means there's a lot of learning to do, right? So it's sort of on us in the scholarly community to work with government to help you figure out what's working well, what's not working well, how do we build on this, because we're going to have an energy transition for decades.
Okay, and how can place-based policies build upon a region's history and identity and leverage existing assets, including infrastructure, workforce, and the academic institutions to the fullest? As a recent example, I would consider the Department of Commerce's Regional Technology and Innovation Hubs. In upstate New York, the Southern Tier has been awarded a battery tech hub, building upon great work by the New York Battery and Energy Storage Technology Consortium and world-class research at SUNY Binghamton. There's a semiconductor manufacturing tech hub to support the huge commitments that have been made by Micron and Global Foundries and other chip manufacturers. So can you build upon that, with that thought for us?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part of the
Yeah,
question?
could you just build upon that whole regional place-based strategy?
Sure. Well, I think you're hitting on what I think is probably the number one insight in the literature on place-based policies, which is that one-size-fits-all strategies are probably not going to be very effective, right? And we've tried some of that in our country with programs like empowerment zones. And I think what you're pointing to is that you really need bottom-up strategies developed by the communities themselves that take advantage of the strengths of those communities. So that might be resources, it might be workforce, it might be sort of taking advantage of emerging technologies that could be cited in that area and hubs of technologies with agglomeration effects. But absolutely, you want to take advantage of those strengths.
Well, with that, I thank you very much, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now go to Ohio's Mr. Latta for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and especially for holding this important hearing today, and thanks for our witnesses for being with us. Since 2005, thanks to the American energy renaissance, the U.S. has been a world leader in reducing carbon emissions. We were able to do this through innovations in technology and improved industrial practices, not top-down government mandates like the Green New Deal. A diverse energy portfolio that includes such as natural gas, nuclear alternatives, hydrogen, in addition to the cleaner and more efficient legacy fuels, is key to both protecting the environment and growing our economy. Looking to the future, I truly believe we must achieve both energy security and national security by utilizing the carbon-free source that is nuclear energy. Dr. Gattie, how can the utilization of nuclear energy help the United States continue to reduce its emissions profile?
Thank you for the question. As you're aware, Congressman Latta, we are closing coal plants across the country. That's been our baseload power plant for many, many years. If we're going to continue to do that, we're going to need nuclear to backfill it. What it's going to allow us to do at that point, if we can get our nuclear enterprise spun back up to the point that it was somewhere back in the 70s, we're going to be attractive to other countries around the world. They are looking for low-carbon resources, but their priority is reliability. They are looking for reliable energy resources. And their partner, they want us to be their nuclear partner long-term. This is something Russia and China understand. Again, as I pointed out earlier, this is an 80-year relationship. We are looking at this in the best interests of those countries and with respect to our own national security. China and Russia are leveraging these for geopolitical objectives. And if we don't counter that, they're going to choose someone else, and it's not going to be us. So I do trust and hope that the members of the committee are going to continue to push, because this is probably our core energy resource on which national security is going to depend.
Thank you. Dr. Schweitzer, how has a more modernized and efficient grid helped to reduce emissions and promote a cleaner environment?
Thank you for the question. We depend on our transmission networks. The way it all happened is that the individual regional franchises chose individually to interconnect for the benefit of each other and their customers and their shareholders. So this collection of interties today is frequently referred to as the grid. And I do think it's important to keep in mind that these interties were built for the mutual benefit of shareholders and customers, and frankly, the environment, to your point. That I had made the point earlier that energy generated in one place in the cleanest ways that we know how, whether it be nuclear or solar or wind, or you pick your favorites of the moment, or gas substituting for coal and so forth, that energy generated at one point can reach people far away at 186,000 miles a second. 11 inches, it goes a nanosecond. I mean, in a nanosecond, it goes 11 inches. It's amazing. So it is possible. And Edison and Insull realized that over a century ago. Insull said something to the effect of, I wish I could see 50 years ahead, which would have been to about 1961 when he wrote it, that I would expect to see transmission lines carrying energy from one part of the country to another, where it's generated in the cheapest ways possible and used most anywhere, so that any class of industry can develop anywhere and at a low, affordable price. And I was interested to hear your colleagues' comments about how important low energy costs are, especially to the people who are not as fortunate as others. It's an obligation, I believe, that we have to liberating humankind. one of the cleanest things that we can do, even with the dirtiest sources of energy that you can think of, is replace with these technologies of replace using human muscle to do work. So as the society advances, not only in this country, but around the world, where our energy systems are displacing using muscle power by virtue of whether it's combustion or photovoltaics or splitting atoms, we're going to be better off environmentally.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My time has expired, and I'll submit my other questions in writing.
I thank the gentleman. I'll now go to Mr. Vesey from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I think that there's some areas that we actually found some agreement on today, and I agree that America has led the world in reducing emissions without sacrificing innovation, economic development, or our national security. I also agree that we've done more than any other country in the world to promote freedom and raise the standard of living and fight poverty, also while maintaining some of the best environmental and labor standards in the world. This is a great legacy for us to build up on, and our nation's energy security is linked to our ability to adapt and innovate while maintaining our energy security. I think that that is also clear. I want to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, because I think that represents also and showcases our commitment to adapting and innovating. And by prioritizing these efforts and investing in diverse energy sources, we are securing our nation's energy independence and mitigating the dangers that we talked about with the environment. With these efforts, we are positioning ourselves as global leaders in the race towards sustainable futures. And many countries, as you know, are transitioning, and they want this technology for themselves. A bipartisan group of us saw that in Norway this summer. And we have to figure out in America how we're going to maintain our energy security, but also how we are going to lead a lot of those efforts that the group of us that went to Norway this summer saw. My question is to Ann Bradbury and Dr. Noah Kaufman. As you know, Texas is the leader when it comes to oil and gas and also wind. We've done a great job in those areas. But I want to ask you about geothermal energy drilling. And as you know, geothermal energy drilling can use some of the very same workforce that the oil and gas drilling uses with little additional training, and the jobs pay very similar. Enhanced geothermal systems have vast potential for domestic, cleaner, firm power production, and that means not just adding reliable, clean power to the grid, but also growing the geothermal drilling workforce. What economic benefits do you foresee in the terms of job creation and economic growth as a result of prioritizing the development and scaling of enhanced geothermal energy technologies, especially in the areas of the country with workforce expertise in drilling?
Thank you, Congressman Vesey, for your question. I might defer to someone with a doctor in front of their name to answer some of your more technical questions, but in terms of your workforce question, I can say that, as you know, oil and gas jobs are some of the most highly paid jobs in the country. The mean average wage is about 2 times what it is among other industries, and it already supports millions of jobs in the great state of Texas. Enhanced geothermal uses many of the same techniques that fracking does in terms of advanced drilling, in terms of hydraulic fracturing. And so as that industry expands, the need for jobs will be very similar to the jobs that are currently found in the oil and gas industry. Things like reservoir engineers, geophysicists, geologists, down to sort of the rig hands and the foremen. So I would say the workforce potentials are significant in terms of the parallels that exist with the current oil and gas industry.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I also wanted to ask a question on the jobs. As you know, it's been really tough in this body, not necessarily on this committee because it's not the committee of jurisdiction, but in this body to deal with fixing and improving and overhauling our broken immigration system. When you think about a lot of the things that we would like to do, whether it's in the area of oil and gas or whether it's in the area of cleaner energy deployment and renewable energy, can you do that? I mean, I heard Dr. Gattie talk a lot about us being able to keep up with Russia and being able to keep up with China, and that we have to be able to counter a lot of what we're seeing from those countries. Can we counter what we're seeing with those countries and employ existing areas of energy and oil and gas, and also deploy more renewable energy without fixing our broken immigration system?
I'll just speak quickly for the oil and natural gas industry and say that a workforce shortage is one of the challenges facing our industry, to be sure. This industry spends millions of dollars on worker training, as I mentioned. These are some incredibly high-paying jobs and incredibly high-paying blue-collar jobs that we're very proud of. And we see the need for increasing that workforce, not shrinking it, as our industry develops over the years.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, I'll now go to Mr. Bouchon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank our witnesses for the testimony this morning. Energy is national security. Dr. Gattie, your testimony describes mistakes in Europe, particularly in Germany, made by implementing top-down energy strategies that had energy security consequences. I recently visited a number of European countries where I had the opportunity to hear firsthand from different leaders about the consequences of their energy policies, investing too heavily in weather-dependent sources and not diversifying their energy mix, making them dependent on Russia primarily, and helping to fund the war in Ukraine initially until recently, when they're all backtracking quickly and eliminating this dependency on Russia for natural gas, primarily by importing more American LNG. Similarly, I worry about the rush to green policies that will put the United States at a greater dependence on our adversary China for energy. Everyone realizes most battery inputs, lithium and other things, come from China. We're going to become more dependent on that. In fact, China just announced restrictions on graphite. So, Dr. Gattie, are we beginning to make some of the same mistakes that some of our European allies have made in the past, in recent history?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I'm not sure about if we are making the mistakes. I think we're seeing some of the symptoms of what those mistakes could be in some states around the country that will remain unnamed right now. We're seeing that during certain times of the year, during winter in particular, we're seeing what some of those policies impacts could be on reliability and on cost as well. I think one of the mistakes that are being made is that we're treating these resources as if they're just interchangeable. Part of my testimony, I pointed out that they're not. Resources are just created differently. Some are dispatchable, some are callable on down the line. They're not interchangeable. It's not like fruits and vegetables and shoes and tires in the market. These resources have very unique value propositions, and I think some of the top-down energy policies need to account for that. And I think in Germany, as you pointed out, their objective was to move away without maintaining the diversity that ensured that they actually could make that transition. I think the transition was the objective and reliability was a sidebar.
Yeah, I mean, they shut down nuclear power plants, increasing, not decreasing their dependence on Russian natural gas, and their advancement of renewables to the extent where the energy costs were really prohibitive for their citizens, and then turn around on the back end and subsidizing the energy for their citizens. And that also ultimately, in my view, with government intervention and the free market economy, ultimately catches up to you, and it certainly did there. This is not a question, Mr. Kaufman, just a comment. The rush to green policies economically actually are collapsing around the world. They're not getting stronger. And you don't have to take, the private sector has opened their eyes. And why is it? Well, there's an article in the day in Wall Street Journal that says green investors were crushed, now it's time to make money. I mean, the point is there's consumer realities, cost, lack of future choice potentially, and then mainly government intervention. What has that been? Whether you consider the Fed the government or not, artificially low interest rates for over a decade, which led people to fund projects in all across energy, but particularly we're talking about green energy investing, 80% funded by debt. And now, of course, rising interest rates coming back to reality is making that almost impossible. And then the fickleness of promised government subsidies, whether that's at the state level or the federal level, because of the cost, and honestly, in my opinion, because of the questionable impact that those actually have. For example, again, I want to make it clear, I'm all the above. I support EVs, I support wind, solar, nuclear, but the financial realities of the situation, particularly now you're seeing that in the EV space, are something we need to really open our eyes to and get away from ideological approaches to this, and let's look at the facts. Consumers are not buying electric vehicles right now, and the cost is extremely high even with government subsidies. People in my rural district, it's not practical. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Chairman yields back, and I'll now go to Ms. Castor from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We face enormous challenges caused by the heating climate, rising costs, rising impacts driven by the burning of fossil fuels. That's why it's so heartening to see the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the investments we intended to strengthen American supply chains and our industrial base through solar and wind and nuclear and energy efficiency to do everything we can to lower costs, to create jobs, work on a safer climate. Just yesterday, I was in St. Petersburg and went out to visit with one of my neighbors who was fortunate to get some of the weatherization dollars. This is going to change his life because he has a heart condition, and the indoor air quality was not great, but replaced the heat pump, the AC unit, just weatherized the home, put in a smart thermostat. It's going to save him 30% on his electric bill, which is important in the state of Florida because over-reliance on gas and extreme weather and high scorching temperatures have driven up cost astronomically since 2019. The average electric bill, if you're a Tampa Electric customer or a Duke Energy customer, has risen 62%. That's just since 2019. So we have a lot to do, but it is heartening to see what's happening across the country based upon the IRA and the infrastructure law. Dr. Kaufman, you say before we passed these laws, the United States was essentially ceding rapidly growing markets for technologies such as solar panels and batteries to producers in China and other countries. Can you elaborate on how the investments aimed at scaling up both the manufacturing and the deployment of all these new technologies, from heat pumps to electric vehicles and everything in between, are benefiting American households and businesses?
Sure, thanks for the question. I mean, I think you hit on the climate motivations for them, which I think can't be underscored enough. How reducing emissions will address these climate risks and just address pollution as well, which affects everyday Americans. But in terms of economic effects, there's a national component to it because I think it's just a risk to our economic competitiveness if you have these emerging incredible technologies like solar and like batteries, which we will use more in the future and we should use more in the future because they are amazing success stories. But if 70–80% of the supply chains are coming from China and other countries, there's undeniable risks there, and risks to the U.S. economy. Not that we need to succeed at any given technology, but right now we are heavily carbon intensive. So making sure that American producers have a chance to successfully compete in a clean economy is just an important risk management strategy.
I always viewed the IRA too, and the infrastructure law is very patriotic. We're going to make things in America again. It's been difficult to keep up with all of the announcements across the country, Kentucky, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, a lot in the Southeast, but all over the country, especially in the industrial Midwest, new factories. How do you keep up with all of these announcements and the job creation?
I probably don't, but I mean, you're touching on the second point I was going to make is that probably more important than just aggregate investments in the United States is where the investments are taking place. And as you say, we're seeing investments in parts of the country that may need it the most, both in terms of fossil-dependent communities, in some cases, communities with lower income populations, which, as you know, was a major emphasis of legislation.
You know, I also serve on the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition with China, and I've been learning more about the carbon border adjustment, another way to counter China and really protect American companies, make sure that they are competitive in global markets. Can you detail how a CBAM policy could also help strengthen America's industrial base?
Well, I mean, I would zoom out just a little bit and say, you know, some form of tariff on sort of the embedded carbon in trade, I think could be a useful aspect of some of the international agreements that I talked about in my testimony. I think if we're going to address internationally traded products, you can't do it without international cooperation because you're always going to have the producers that you know, can undercut on price with
We're hearing a lot from our
product.
allies in the EU, UK, Australia, Norway about this. So.
Right. So I think what you need, I mean, a tariff is one component of it, but I think you've got to work with other countries to develop sort of an incentive-compatible agreement that sort of has everybody rowing in the same direction.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Julie yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Palmer from Alabama. Roll Tide for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Just before I get started, just like to say there's no border adjustment tax and no tariff that will replace the strategic significance of procuring our critical minerals and rare earth elements. This is not just a matter of figuring out how to reduce CO2 emissions, it's a matter of national security. Mr. Schweitzer, on that theme, when we talk about critical minerals and rare earth elements, I think it should be noted that offshore wind requires 13 times more minerals than a natural gas generation facility generating the same amount of power. Onshore wind requires 8 times more and solar 6 times more. Is there anything out there technologically that will replace the need for critical minerals? That's kind of a joke because obviously there isn't.
Well, since it's a joke, I guess I don't have to answer it directly. I'm very concerned about things like innovation hubs and tech hubs and subsidize this and that and mandates and bans and taxes and tariffs and quotas all being used as somehow tools when what they are is market distorters. Exactly. And we're at a point in our society when we need to make it easier, not harder, easier to build a factory. It takes, some people say, 2 or 3 times as long to build one in the United States than it does in China. So capital, which always gets its pay, is going to move in that direction. And I beg to please do what we can to make it easier, frankly, to drill a hole, mine and refine, to produce, to manufacture, invent and create, whether it is critical minerals or diplomas or pills or food products or clothing, is that we have to be able to produce and compete to serve.
On that point, we're not going to get to 100% renewable. We're not going to get to net zero by 2050. There's no engineering scenario, no financial scenario that will allow that. That's a pipe dream. To get there would require a 4,200% increase in lithium demand. It would require a 2,500% increase in demand for graphite, 2,100% increase for cobalt, 1,900% increase increase in demand for nickel, 700% increase in demand for rare earth elements, and you can't cut a hole in the ground anywhere in the United States right now without going through a 10 or 12-year process just to get a permit.
That's true.
As a matter of national security, we need to immediately permit mining for our critical minerals and our rare earth elements, because what we should have learned from the war in Ukraine is very fundamental. First of all, it didn't create the energy crisis, it exposed it. But secondly, and maybe more importantly, it should have educated every nation in the world, but no nation should be reliant on an adversarial nation for something that's critical to its economy and its national security as energy. And going to 100% renewable with the lack of mining for these critical minerals in the United States would make us almost 100% reliant on China. And I think disastrous for our not only our economy, but for our national security. I want to ask you something else about carbon capture. I support carbon capture. The National Carbon Capture Center is in my district, actually, in Wilsonville, Alabama. Could you give me some thoughts on where we're heading with the technology on that? Because we've had a couple of facilities that were really built around the concept of carbon capture, most notably Kemper in Mississippi that is now shuttered. There was another one in Texas that for the limited time that it operated was basically built around the oil and gas industry in Texas, but it's now shuttered. So where do you see that going?
I think that the carbon capture, there's really no market forces that are driving for it. I do know some projects where people have captured carbon and tried to find markets for the CO2, and I don't know how successful they are. So the carbon capture is sort of an uphill battle, and instead of trying to capture it, it's probably better to be producing less of not only the carbon CO2, but also
My time's
of the
expiring.
methane.
On that point, producing less, I think the small modular reactors, advanced
Beautiful.
reactors is the way to go. Thank you,
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Now I recognize Mr. Sarbanes for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. As we've seen, as this discussion certainly emphasizes, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, control of vital energy resources can be quickly reshaped by global conflicts, meaning it is in the best interest of our national and economic security to, as best we can, foresee and prepare for ever-changing global circumstances. We also must stay ahead of the curve in renewable energy development so that we maintain sufficient and diverse supplies of energy to meet our tandem goals of powering and developing global economies and responsibly addressing the broad-reaching impacts of climate change on the world's most vulnerable populations. Succeeding in these goals will require strong collaboration among international partners, something the U.S. has an opportunity to do at COP28. Dr. Kaufman, how important is it for the U.S. to facilitate international cooperation to increase global energy security and climate responsibility during these COP28 discussions?
Thanks for the question. I'm glad you highlighted it because I think it is critically important, and sometimes, particularly given the understandable focus on domestic producers and industries, we lose sight of the importance of, international cooperation because, in the end of the day, the global trading system should benefit everybody, right? We should be building wealth for the entire world, and as you said, the more we can do that in collaboration with our partners, and the more the United States can show its leadership in doing that, whether it's sort of designing agreements or encouraging other countries to invest in innovation, I think this will only help to help us pursue our climate and energy security goals.
There's no planet B. This is a global effort. We have to cooperate internationally. The U.S. needs to take a leadership role. Biden administration is trying to do that. We need Congress to support those efforts as much as possible. The U.S. leadership in this area must also extend beyond the annual COP28 conversations, as I'm sort of alluding to here. We must work year-round to develop bilateral and multilateral partnerships that can allow for exchange of knowledge among researchers, accelerate the development of innovative technologies, facilitate business-to-business exchanges, and share best practices. So one case in point for this, our Eastern Mediterranean allies, including Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, are well positioned to play a critical role in these efforts. They have a strong record for energy cooperation. Congress recognized this when it passed the bipartisan Eastern Mediterranean Security and Energy Partnership Act in 2019, which authorized the establishment of the U.S. Eastern Mediterranean Energy Center, modeled off the successful Israel-U.S. Binational Industrial R&D Center, or the BIRD Center, which has been around for a while. The Eastern Mediterranean Energy Center would be a consortium of businesses, academia, and researchers with a goal to, quote, leverage academic and private sector expertise to focus on renewable and other decarbonized energy sources, water science, mutually agreed upon technology transfer, and technical analysis of regional energy developments. So Dr. Kaufman, can you speak to how this kind of a center, collaborative effort, the Eastern Mediterranean Energy Center, or a multilateral partnership such as this could allow the U.S. and our international partners to stay ahead of the curve in energy innovation and regional energy security?
Sure, thanks for the question. I mean, the one theme I think that has come out of all of our testimonies today is the importance of innovation. And I think the process of innovation is only going to be stronger if it's a collaborative effort. And you know, the United States has been a leader in innovation, but let's be honest, we're not going to do it by ourselves, and we don't want to. We don't want to do it by ourselves. So the more that we, you know, one of the most important roles government can play is to, you know, support public and private efforts, and hopefully in collaboration, to produce, you know, lower cost, more effective technologies. And the types of collaborations you're talking about sound like a way, a means towards that end.
Thanks very much. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now go to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, panel, for being here. This hearing is about the serious need to course-correct America's energy policy. We were on the right track, I believe, until the current administration decided to choose reliance on China and ineffective climate policies over American innovation and energy security. Offshoring fuel production, manufacturing, and mining overseas only serves to make bureaucrats in Washington, and I might add most COP28 delegates, of which I will be one but not in agreement with them, to feel better about their climate pledges. But emissions don't stop over international borders, especially when China has worse environmental and labor policies, abusive labor policies. We know that with right investments, we can produce cleaner, safer, better energy here in the United States than anywhere in the world, and we've proven it. Ms. Bradbury and Dr. Gattie, the Department of Energy engages in energy research and invests in U.S. energy capabilities historically in all potential forms of energy. If the U.S. is going to fund, and this is my question, if the U.S. is going to fund research and development, can you talk about what kinds of research and funding can provide the greatest impacts on energy security, like nuclear or more advanced fossil technologies? Ms. Bradbury, we'll start out with you, or unless you want to.
No, I'll take a stab.
Okay.
So I think that, first of all, it's most critical that the federal government is not involved in picking winners and losers among energy sources.
Right.
And so among some of the technologies that my industry is most focused on, things like carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, geothermal, there are significant barriers to sort of the commercial scalability of these at this point in time, and some technological barriers as well. So while industry is doing its part to invest and to innovate in these areas. I think that looking at a holistic set of options that include fossil options would be the best course of action.
Dr. Gattie? I can't disagree and won't try to disagree. There's nothing to disagree on with what Ms. Bradbury said. I also have a problem with DOE picking winners and losers here. We try to emphasize nuclear a lot. My concern, though, is that when DOE takes up as its objective to pursue low carbon, zero carbon, they're essentially focusing on renewables, it seems right now. I think that's a mistake. In the nuclear space, however, I think one of the issues we're dealing with, Congressman, is we are just kind of scattering money all over, and it's just dropping in small buckets from here to there. We don't really seem to have a nuclear policy strategy. That's what I'm hoping that the members of this body actually take up as something that reorients our nuclear policy to be more strategic instead of seemingly scattered right now. But I really don't want DOE to pick winners and losers.
Well, let me jump to my next question beyond my question I should have taken next. While you're talking about that, we'll continue to cede, I believe, our global leadership on nuclear energy to countries like China and Russia if we keep going the direction we're going. Can you update us on the state of advanced nuclear technology in the international marketplace, and what are the biggest barriers to exporting these technologies, and how can Congress remove those barriers?
So right now, as far as advanced reactors, there really aren't a lot of advanced reactors being deployed right now. China and Russia are still building large nuclear reactors. They're exporting those technologies, and they've got countries, in particular Russia right now. We're focusing here in the U.S. on SMRs. That's where we've shifted our attention. China and Russia are not shifting their attention there. They're adding SMRs to their nuclear future and their nuclear objectives, but they're not abandoning the big nuclear reactors. One of the problems, to your point, Congressman, China and Russia don't account for what the cost is necessarily. If you were to ask what is the levelized cost of electricity for a nuclear reactor in China and Russia, good luck getting an answer.
They don't care.
Sir?
They don't care.
It's not in their spreadsheet calculations. That is not why they're doing it. They're building up their domestic energy base, but it is an instrument and arm of their state-owned enterprises to meet CCP objectives. It's not how the U.S. works. We don't want to work that way, so we've got a hill to climb, and I think one of the first hills that we need to climb is find out just exactly what we need to do to spin up a nuclear industrial base, because we simply don't know what it's going to take to do that right now.
Okay. Thank you. My time's expired. I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. We're trying to do that today with the first big nuclear bill we're marking up. I'll now go to Mr. Custer, who I skipped over a few minutes ago, and I apologize to her, but Ms. Custer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Duncan, and Ranking Member DeGette for hosting this important hearing. Dr. Kaufman, I appreciate you taking the time to come testify before this committee. Since this is the subcommittee's globally focused hearing, I think it's important to talk about what is arguably the most effective tool for addressing carbon emissions globally, which would be a price on carbon. I'm a big believer in a carbon price because it creates a market incentive to reduce emissions and force those who emit carbon to bear the cost of polluting. The majority's memo highlights an important fact, and I think the chair highlighted this in his opening statement. Life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from U.S. natural gas are 40% lower than life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from Russian natural gas. This is because the U.S. has strong environmental standards that help the industry perform better than some of the competitors. While my vision in the long run is to end our dependence on fossil fuels, in the short and intermediate term, we know that the global economy will continue to need carbon-based forms of energy. So we should mitigate the worst effects of using fossil fuels through some type of price on pollution. So to Dr. Kaufman, this is a two-part question. First, could a carbon price or methane border adjustment mechanism help reward U.S. companies for minimizing emissions in their production processes and make U.S. products more attractive on global markets? And number two, how could a carbon price support international collaboration in other hard-to-decarbonize sectors?
Yeah, thank you for the question. You ask an economist about a carbon price, you'll see our face light up. It's an incredibly valuable policy tool, and I think anyone who's supportive of the power of markets and recognizing of the risks of climate change should be embracing carbon pricing, right? Because all you're doing is using the power of markets to figure out, what are the low-cost opportunities to reduce emissions without anyone needing to know in advance what they are. It can also help boost innovation if you have a strong future price signal, as well as raise a bunch of money for the government. So it all makes sense. I mean, I guess one flag is that, as you know, we have, over the last couple of years, we've established a whole bunch of policies, including the Inflation Reduction Act, that do some of the same things that a carbon price would do in terms of changing relative prices of dirtier and cleaner products. So we're not starting from scratch anymore. But one thing I think I heard you say is, the focus on industry and very sort of hard to abate emissions. I think this is still a huge opportunity for some form of carbon pricing. First of all, because those sectors don't have a price signal currently, you expect industry to be very responsive to price signals. And just in the realm of international cooperation, having a carbon price, which our allies already do. Europe has a very high carbon price. Canada has a carbon price. It would go a long way towards helping us cooperate on climate and clean energy with some of our key allies.
Great, very helpful, thank you. This question is for Ms. Bradbury. I want to quickly turn to you. I think there is support for a carbon price from some unexpected places. Is it true that some of your petroleum-producing members support a carbon price?
I can't speak for individual members. I do believe some of my member companies have expressed support for a carbon price.
And if petroleum-producing companies support a carbon price, I hope my Republican colleagues who care about the perspective of the fossil fuel industry will support Representative Carbajal and Peter's Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. One last question to Dr. Kaufman. In your testimony, you point out that many states in the Gulf, notably UAE, are beginning to wean their economies of fossil fuel exports. In the process, they're creating new jobs in new industries. What lessons could the U.S. learn from the Gulf about ways to diversify fossil fuel economies into new sectors?
Things for the question. Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I don't think we should be mimicking the action of petrostates, but I do think that these are case studies of, more than anything else, it's just countries that are trying, right? It's countries that have the resources and are devoting the resources to economic diversification and doing it when the times are still good, right? That's going to be if you wait until you have distressed communities and you try to prop them up, that's just going to be fundamentally more difficult. And I guess the other thing is to really try to focus on your strengths, right? So I mentioned this earlier with respect to place-based policies. I think that's what you're seeing in the Middle East too. You have a place like Dubai that has a certain type of workforce and regulatory environment that it has used to sort of transition to be a hub for international finance. That's certainly not going to work everywhere, but I think that's what you have to do in U.S. oil, gas, coal communities is to figure out what are the industries of the future that we can help diversify our economies with.
Yeah, my time is up. Thank you. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentlelady. I now recognize Ms. Lesko from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here today. Ms. Bradbury, what will the Biden administration's EPA new rule on methane emissions, how will it affect independent oil and gas companies?
Ms. Lesko, thank you for your response. As I Mentioned in my testimony, the United States oil and gas companies are leading the way in reducing methane emissions. And industry has stated that we could support the reasonable and workable regulation of methane. The final rule was dropped this weekend and is 1,600 pages long, and so we are still trying to get our arms around it. I will say one of the really important provisions of the rule would be, does it incentivize technology? This is an area that we're talking about today. And our initial indications is that it does fall short in that sense. And so we certainly hope that the EPA would reconsider some of the alternative technologies that would be allowed to be used for compliance to incentivize, not discourage those, to ensure that the innovation that the industry is spearheading that we've talked about so much today isn't stifled under this regulation.
Thank you. After you review the 1,600 pages that was dropped at, 3 a.m., could you get back to us and let us know what your thoughts are, talking points on it? I would appreciate it. Also, Ms. Bradbury, in 2019, the Department of Energy published a report that showed retrofitting a coal plant in Colorado with carbon capture, utilization, and storage had 37% lower CO2 emissions and was much cheaper for ratepayers than a proposed alternative combination of renewables and a gas plant without CCUS. Why? Because I assume every megawatt of renewable power produced must be backed up by firm generation such as natural gas. The same concept applies to natural gas combined cycle power plants built with CCUS technology. Biden's own Department of Energy has estimated this type of generation is much cheaper than wind and solar. Ms. Bradbury, do you believe we should be building more natural gas plants with CCUS that are more reliable than intermittent sources?
I think natural gas is the foundation of our energy grid. It is the reason that we lead the world in emissions reductions. 60% of the emissions reductions that we've achieved have been because of a switch to natural gas in the power sector, and that it also provides a foundational source of reliable power to offset the intermittent sources of renewables. So I think this is absolutely critical, especially as our grid continues to be stretched thinner and thinner as more and more demand is placed on it. I also think that we need to ensure that the regulations are on pace with the technology and don't prescribe overly prescriptive standards of CCUS that industry is not ready to meet, especially at a commercial scale.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was on a phone conversation with a group that actually is more liberal thinking, and they really thought CCUS was the answer, the best bang for the buck to reduce emissions. And so I thought it was good that a more liberal thinking organization actually agreed on that. Mr. Gattie, in a LinkedIn post you stated, quote, China has made very clear that it has no intentions of divesting from fossil fuels anytime soon. Nonetheless, U.S. policymakers continue promoting the narrative that U.S. decarbonization is an act of leadership. Such naivety favors the CCP's strategy to marginalize and eventually displace America as the global superpower. Now, you have spoke about this some in your testimony, but I want to let you know that I agree with you, and can you please expand upon what you'd like to say about this?
Thank you for the, I'm glad you're following my, I guess that was a LinkedIn post, wasn't it, Congresswoman? China is in a position where, and I'm not behind the doors of the CCP, but if I were, I would probably encourage the U.S. to continue divesting from reliable domestic energy resources. If I were the competitor here, and this is just simply part of what H.R. McMaster referred to as strategically empathizing with your competitors, China would certainly want us to do that, not just to become more dependent on them for minerals and metals, but they know that that's going to put us in a very difficult position to stand up an industrial base that is very, very strong and can respond quickly. So it's again, I think we have to think about this in terms of our industrial base, not just an energy transition, but what's it going to do to our industrial base relative to China and other competitors.
John Lay's time's expired. I'll now go to Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Duncan and Ranking Member DeGette, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses for sharing your opinions and your knowledge with us today. Every day, the harms of climate change become clearer. Extreme and unprecedented weather conditions accelerated by global greenhouse gas emissions are making it harder to protect our ecosystems, maintain a sustainable economy, ensure the safety of infrastructure of homes in our homes, and preserve the health of families across America and across the world. The good news is that at every level of government, from local to federal to global, we can transition to a cleaner economy. I've seen it many times with my own eyes. If we set proper and aggressive incentives, we can clean up our act, and also being guided by the technology changes that continue to pleasantly surprise us. For instance, in 2004, I worked to ensure that the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the largest municipal water and power utility in the nation, that they should generate at least 20% of its electricity from renewable energy sources by 2017. They met that goal. And in addition to that, they went on to a more aggressive goal to set it to 35% by 2020, and they met that goal as well, even though there were many people saying that it couldn't work, it wouldn't work, and all the while looking at the ratepayers as well, the lowest common denominator when it comes to the people who pay for their electricity and power and water from that municipality. And just last Congress, Democrats worked together to pass the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which are already advancing clean, homegrown energy, cutting costs for families, and creating new jobs across America. Dr. Kaufman, recognizing that action must be taken across all levels of government, could you please discuss how to better connect high-level federal policies and international commitments to local governments and communities?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I think it's a very important one, and I think you're right to flag that. The step one is probably buy-in from local communities and subnational governments, and I think we've seen more and more of that. And the more sort of cohesive of a policy you have, the more cost-effective and equitable it's going to be, because I think in many areas we need bottom-up strategies that the communities are going to lead on. But when it comes to national priorities like energy security or national security, or international priorities like climate change, you inevitably need sort of a top-down federal government action as well.
Thank you. The IIJA and the IRA included historic emission-slashing investments like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and the Methane Emission Reduction Program. Can you discuss how the investments made in these laws will help the United States meet our global climate commitments, and what are the next steps for the U.S. to take to build on our recent work and continue our legacy of leadership across the globe?
Sure, thanks. I think the high-level way to look at it is that before these laws were passed, it just wasn't clear that the United States was on track to reduce our emissions, maybe at all this decade, and certainly not anywhere near in line with the international commitments that we've made. So to me, that's the most important thing, is that we've turned that around, and now we are implementing laws that are pushing down emissions. And it does seem like, from what I've heard today, basically everyone in the room is sort of acknowledging the importance of climate change. But I think it's important to sort of also acknowledge what that means, right? If we're serious about not just a 1.5 or a 2-degree target, if we're serious about any climate targets, it means eventually we've got to get to net zero emissions, right? That's what the scientists tell us. Otherwise, warming will just continue. So I think what we need to do is figure out where we are today and how, when we want to get to net zero emissions. And that's going to take some transformational changes, right? I think there's been a lot of discussion of more sort of incremental approaches, and reduced emissions are always good. But I think one thing you're flagging is the need that these policies have followed through on, which is to focus on not just incremental changes, but incremental changes that take us on a successful pathway to net zero.
Is incremental change realistic? Or the converse of that, is being able to change overnight, is that really possible? The answer is no, we can't change overnight, so it has to be incremental change. I've seen that my time has expired, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Chair will now go to Mr. Pence for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member DeGette, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. It's become abundantly clear that this administration has grossly mismanaged our nation's transportation industry. Amidst lucrative incentives and anti-ICE vehicle regulations, EVs continue to pile up on dealer lots across the country, as I have personally witnessed. And today there was a Politico article talking about the fact that the charging stations aren't being rolled out. I hold hearings back in Indiana, and I talk to the state, all the people that are participating in the rollout of the electrification of the transportation industry, and the impediments are huge. Demand isn't there to warrant the investment, even though they have the money. For 3 years now, I've voiced my concerns on this committee that the Biden administration can't create demand by forcing supply. Incremental issue. In the administration's latest gambit to bail out the EV value chain, EPA is pushing or considering their eRINs proposal to bring electric vehicles into the renewables fuel standard, and we can call that a carbon tax, on its way. Instead of generating RINs at the point of blending, this proposal creates a convoluted process to award credits to the car manufacturers and other third-party participants, unspecified at this point. I fear buying obligations for eRINs will fall on existing liquid fuel refineries who could be forced to buy even more credits than they have to buy now. The proposal could send ripples across the liquid fuel industry, driving up costs from the point of production down to the gas station, manufacturers, households, and maybe even more. Unfortunately, this could drive refiners and producers out of business, forcing higher imports of liquid fuels, as we've seen some refiners sold their refineries here and moved offshore. Heavy-duty on-road has great potential for hydrogen and ethanol-based engines, improving the environment, whereas cities and densely populated areas could benefit from specifically electrification. Innovators across the country are leading the way to develop new solutions. Take Cummins Engine Company from my hometown of Columbus, Indiana, a world leader in hydrogen and alternative fuel development. Ms. Bradbury, specifically on the eRINs, I'm concerned the end result of EPA's eRIN proposal could send ripples upstream, impacting the entire liquid fuels industry. What would be the impact on the industries you represent if compliance obligations for eRINs drives up costs for refiners and producers, and how would it drive up costs for them?
Thank you, Mr. Pence, for that question. I will say, as a starting point, our industry, or excuse me, my association has not to date taken a position on renewable fuel standard. That being said, we support the CARS Act, which is on the floor today, and have taken the position that, as we know, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. There's not a silver bullet approach to addressing climate and to reducing emissions, and that these solutions need to be looked at holistically through the lens of what will it do, not just in terms of emissions, but how will it impact our economic security, especially costs to consumers, as well as our energy security in terms of raw materials and where these products come from and are made. So with that, we'd be happy to look into it further, but
Sure, I understand that you you got two levels of refiners that you're representing, and they come at it a little differently and maybe impacted a little differently. But if eRINs were required on top of RINs, what would be the impact on smaller refiners, of which there are many in the United States?
I only represent upstream producers, not downstream refiners. So, we could look into what the impact would be on the production side or the supply side, but I can't speak up to the refining side.
So if that shut down small refiners, say in Wyoming, Utah, or whatever, wherever, that would have a huge impact.
I would have to defer to my colleagues in the refining industry.
All right. Okay, with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now go to Ms. Fletcher from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for your insights today. I think this has been a really useful hearing, and I want to touch on a few of the things that, and the themes that we've already talked about today. But first, I think it's important to start by observing that the United States is the global leader in energy production and in environmental protection. And we can keep it that way, right? Through innovation, collaboration, and smart regulation. So just looking to the last Congress, we've heard a lot already today about the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and through those, we've shown that we don't have to choose between leading the world in energy production and protecting the environment. We can do both, we have to do both. And what we've seen is that this fall, the United States set another record for domestic energy production, reaching 13.24 million barrels a day in September. At the same time, we established a new program that we've talked about a little today and that I want to focus on, which is a new program to limit our methane emissions, making American exports more competitive in the world market. And I do want to acknowledge the comments from Mr. Peters about how much of that was driven by industry prior to this regulation. I think it's important to understand that we are driving this innovation here. And we have added to that, creating billions in subsidies, creating a flood of energy investment with innovative companies, including many in my district in Houston, leading the way. As these programs roll out, it's really important to ensure that they are administered in a way that incentivizes competition and maintains our edge in protecting the environment and driving energy abundance. And so I really want to direct my questions to Ms. Bradbury about some of these regulations on the methane emissions reduction program, because I think it's important with the time that I have to talk about these provisions contained in the IRA directed the EPA to update Subpart W of the greenhouse gas reporting program. And there's still some uncertainty, despite the 1,600 pages of regulations that have come out, there's still some uncertainty around those regulations, those updates, and it's my understanding that EPA is currently working on developing the updates. So right now, Subpart W requires companies to report estimated annual emissions using prescribed methodologies from scientific studies and collective research. It's one of the issues we talked about when we were crafting the program here, that assessing these fees by a formula has its own set of challenges and affects the incentives. And so, Ms. Bradbury, I want to ask you, in the time that we have, I'm just going to throw out my questions so you can address them. And if we run out of time, if you want to submit them for the record, that's great. But one, can you tell us about the investments and commitments that your member companies are making to reduce emissions? Two, would the inclusion of the ability to include empirical data measuring their own reductions in Subpart W incentivize reduced emissions as opposed to the formula? And then third, can you just touch on, in your opinion, what are the most important factors that EPA should consider when updating Subpart W to incentivize oil and natural gas companies to reduce their methane emissions?
Congresswoman Fletcher, thank you so much for this question on this really critical and not widely understood issue. So Subpart W is how oil and gas industry reports its emissions to the world. It is how America shows its progress. It is based on a rigorous set of emission standards, and it is the best in the world. That being said, it should constantly be updated to ensure it is as accurate as possible. And EPA recently issued a proposed rule to update Subpart W, which we believe goes in the wrong direction. We believe it would actually result in inflated emissions estimates and double counting of emissions. That would not only show increased emissions, not because emissions are be going up, but because the underlying factors and the math has changed. This is also really important because this is the basis for the methane tax. So companies are assessed based on this number. Congress directed and industry asked that EPA include the use of empirical data in terms of how we report emissions, because as we've talked about extensively today, this technology, this innovation is getting better and better, and we want to be able to show our work. And unfortunately, EPA, again, went in the wrong direction and seems to be making it more difficult for companies to use that empirical data, again, both to show their progress to the world, but also, again, on which the methane tax will be assessed. As a result, under the proposed rule, the scope and amount of funds of the tax that companies will have to pay has jumped dramatically from where Congress originally passed the methane tax, which you and I didn't necessarily agree on, but I think it has now sort of escalated our concerns because now exponentially more companies will be caught in the methane tax, and they will pay exponentially more if EPA's Subpart W is finalized as proposed.
And I'm going to go over my time, but to the extent you could supplement your response in writing with any other factors we should consider, I would appreciate it. I know our chairman would appreciate it. I appreciate you yielding to me, and I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. I now go to Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to do something probably out of the ordinary, which doesn't surprise many of you, I'm sure. I remember Dr. Kaufman, his comments saying he thought that Congress is doing this as a risk management strategy, in his opinion, end quote. I remember what President Reagan said. He said, the 8 scariest words from government, I'm here to help. So please don't help us, is what we're saying. Let industry do the innovation. And I'm going to say, as Dr. Bradbury pointed out, she said she didn't have a doctor, but if you have kids, you know your doctor, nursemaid, coach, best friend, you know how that works, right, Ann? You pointed out, let the industry do the innovation. And by the way, there are a few situations where anyone as capable as moms is doing those innovations, just so y'all know. In Ms. Bradbury's exchange with Congressman Johnson, they talked about Russians, quote, propagandizing, end quote, against our energy sector. In 2017, then Science Committee Chair Lamar Smith and I sent a letter to Steve Mnuchin, Secretary of U.S. Treasury. We found out that some Russian oligarchs were sending money to a shell corporation in Bermuda that were then funneling that money to Greenpeace, Sierra Club, and some of the others. We thought that they violated 2 foreign laws, two U.S. laws, Foreign Agent Registration Act, FARA, and also money laundering. Whatever reason, Secretary Mnuchin decided not to do anything about that. Then you had a conversation with Gary Palmer where he said, no nation should rely on another adversarial country for its energy. And Dr. Gattie, you pointed that out in some of your discussion. And actually, I have a copy of something that was sent to me. And you make the point that the last time we added 3 billion people to cities was 1950 to 2010. Oil demand grew from 10 million barrels a day to 88 million barrels a day. Natural gas use rose from 8 cubic feet to 113 trillion cubic feet. Coal demand increased from 2 billion to 7.1 billion tons. Steel consumption increased from 200 to 1,400 million tons. And then you ask the question, who will supply this oil, gas, coal, and steel? This time there will be also a massive expansion in batteries and critical minerals, all of which are dominated by, you got it, the Chinese. Even though you said you weren't behind the doors with the communist Chinese, and that's a good thing, you certainly have your finger, you have it pegged. Then you go on to say the U.S. must include in its energy and climate policy calculus that our authoritarian great power competitors will exploit for their own geopolitical advantage what many in the world are calling a crisis and an existential threat to humanity, that being climate change. So my question is for y'all, in light of our warning to Steve Mnuchin in 2017 and now Dr. Gattie's warning, my question to each of you is, and I'll start with you, Dr. Schweitzer, down here, don't you think we ought to take that into account, what Dr. Gattie has recently warned us about China?
Absolutely. I think several of us have shared our concerns about energy security of the United States, and it is essential that we maintain and enhance. Prior to deregulation, which is really re-regulation, electric power utilities maintained something on the order of a 20% margin in transmission and generation resources. that margin is gone. You need look no further than to see what's happened, nearly happened last Christmas in New York or in Texas or in California. We must restore that margin or the lights could go off at the most painful.
Well, thank you for that. Let me move on to Dr. Bradbury. What do you say, Dr. Ann?
Thank you for the promotion. I think, we clearly feel that energy security, national security are inextricably linked. And I think you need to look no further than, Russians' propaganda agenda against U.S. Oil and natural gas to be evidence of that.
Absolutely. Dr. Kaufman, what say you?
Energy security is important. I agree. Diversification of supply chains is important. I agree with that too. I guess I'll just add that cooperation, where we can do so in a way that benefits Americans, is also important. And, and if we try to cut, trading partners like China out of our supply chains, American consumers are going to pay a lot more for their products than
Dr. Gattie, what say you?
I agree. China's our primary national security threat.
All right. Well, I'm going to yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognizes Dr. Schreier for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses here today. In my home state of Washington, we've adopted an ambitious climate goal to completely eliminate carbon emissions from our energy generation portfolio by 2045, which means we need to utilize many new emission-free sources like advanced nuclear, wind, solar, in addition to the abundant hydropower that we already are fortunate to have. As you pointed out in your testimony, Dr. Kaufman, we've made tremendous progress by investing in key steps to transition to clean energy. The CHIPS and Science Act has invested in novel technologies in the R&D phase, while the bipartisan infrastructure law accelerates the commercialization of those energy innovations, and then the Inflation Reduction Act focuses on incentivizing early adoption of these technologies, helping to lower energy bills for consumers and spurring demand signals for the private sector. And this funding happily is making its way to Washington State and Washington's 8th District. Roughly $1 billion is coming to the Pacific Northwest to spur a regional hydrogen hub. And I was so excited to lead in this effort, to bring this funding, because we will produce the greenest hydrogen in the nation through our wealth of hydropower. Dr. Kaufman, looking forward, there's still a laundry list of challenges brought on by the climate crisis that we need to solve domestically and globally, including those connecting clean energy projects to the grid through transmission. As you've pointed out in your testimony, commitments and diplomatic relationships that we make as a global leader go hand in hand with our efforts here at home. Now, my colleagues, Representative Castor and Custer, have asked a little bit about instituting a carbon border adjustment and a domestic carbon pricing system. And I know that the EU and many other countries have implemented carbon pricing around the globe. And I was wondering if you could speak to some of the lessons learned in those countries and maybe some implementation considerations for a similar program in the United States.
Sure, thanks for the question. First lesson, incentives work, right? What we've seen in places like Europe is that as carbon prices have risen over the last decade, there's been a massive shift away from, in particular, coal-fired electricity. And that's sort of a constant theme that you see in carbon pricing policies around the world. So you institute a carbon price, emissions will fall, the government will get a bunch of revenue that hopefully they can use in productive ways. I think the second big lesson has been it's got to be designed carefully. And you can think of that in a couple ways. Number one, you don't just want to raise energy prices for people, especially vulnerable people, without being careful about sort of mitigating the impacts on those who can't afford it, right? So I think more and more, I haven't seen a carbon pricing policy proposal in 5 or 10 years that doesn't have an element of let's make sure this is a progressive policy where we're using the revenues in a way that benefit lower income households, and sort of the communities across the jurisdiction that are sort of heavily dependent on carbon-intensive industries. So, and then maybe one other thing I'll flag, because you mentioned border adjustments, is you do have to be careful when we're talking about putting a price on internationally traded products, that you're doing it either in collaboration with other countries, or you're careful that you're not sort of shifting carbon-intensive industries from your countries to other countries instead. And that's why I think, you know, a key priority for this Congress could be to develop policies for these types of products, internationally traded products like steel, where you could have a price, but you do it in collaboration with other countries that are rowing in the same direction.
Thank you. Specifically, since you were talking about carbon pricing and doing it in a progressive way, there's some bipartisan support for a fee and dividend type arrangement where the fee doesn't go to the government, instead it goes right back to consumers, such that the little guy actually benefits the most, and that turns it into a progressive policy that still pushes for clean energy. Do you have any 20 seconds left? Any comments about that?
If you did that, if you took in, if you charged a carbon price and you took all the money and divided it up equally, you would end up with a hugely progressive policy, because who are the people who spend the most on carbon-intensive products? It's the rich people, so they would be paying more of the carbon price, and the lower and middle income folks would be receiving more in the dividends. I mean, I think you'd want to design it carefully, because now we have a climate strategy to work on top of, but I think the philosophy makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. Yield back.
Julay's time's expired, and I'll now go to Ohio's Mr. Balderson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. My first question is for Ms. Bradbury. You're not a doctor, right? He was just saying that.
I'm not a doctor.
Thank you. Okay. We've discussed the many environmental benefits from the switch to clean American natural gas. As a result of the shale revolution, America is the global leader in exporting LNG and emissions reductions. Beyond strengthening our national security and the corresponding environment benefits, the shale revolution has been a game changer for local communities in areas like southeastern Ohio, where Congressman Johnson and myself serve. In just a few weeks, the Muskingum watershed, under the direction of my dear friend, Mr. Craig Butler, which covers most of the congressional district, released a report showing revenues from Utica shale leases have bolstered the region's economy by nearly $1 billion. These leases have allowed the district to invest in upgraded recreation and camping facilities, new conservation programs, efforts to improve water quality, and have supported thousands of new jobs. Ms. Bradbury, I referred to this report during an environmental subcommittee hearing last week, but I'd like to get your thoughts as well. Can you discuss the efforts that AXPC's members have taken to be responsible stewards of the environment and investments they've made in local communities where they operate?
Mr. Balderson, thank you for the question. And, you know, I don't think people think of Ohio first and foremost when they think of natural gas and oil powerhouses, but it is one of our leading producers of both oil and natural gas. So there's a lot to be proud of there.
Thank you.
I will also say our companies, and I represent most of the leading producers in Ohio, are incredibly proud of the role they play in communities across Ohio. You mentioned the $1 billion in contributions that they make to the economy. I will say, you know, when we talk about, we talk a lot about permit reform, but first and foremost, our companies take our social license to operate very seriously. They invest millions of dollars in the communities in which they operate. So there's the state taxes, the local taxes, community fees, and hundreds of millions of dollars paid to the royalty owners. And on top of that, there's millions of dollars in philanthropy and volunteer work to support local organizations. And especially in the Appalachia area, a region that was really getting left behind in a lot of ways economically, the oil and natural gas industry has turned around many of those communities and supported a lot of existing industries that were losing jobs and going under. And so I think it's really been the lifeblood for many communities across this country, Ohio being one of them.
Couldn't agree with you more. And I was there in 2010 when the boom started, so, as chairman of the committee. So thank you for your answer, Ms. Bradbury. My next question is for Ms. Bradbury and Dr. Gattie, but Doctor, I'm going to let you go first, and Ms. Bradbury went already. European natural gas prices are still double their long-term average and more than quadruple prices in the United States. During a hearing last week, my colleague, Mr. Palmer, made a great point that the war in Ukraine didn't necessarily create Europe's energy crisis, but it did expose these problems. I don't think Europe became reliant on Russia to meet its energy needs overnight. Can you discuss how Europe got in this position in the first place? Doctor first, and then Ms. Bradbury.
This actually probably goes back even, as far as just looking back at the record. There were, back in the days of Ronald Reagan, Europe was looking at trying to get gas from Russia, and we were trying to discourage that even back in the 80s. It was a decision that they made because they assumed that we were in a new world and everybody was going to get along and everybody was going to play fair. And they overplayed their hand. So they got in that position because they assumed that they were going to be able to depend on a regional partner. And fortunately, to that end, we were in reserve for them. We actually had the resources to come back them up when they realized they had overplayed their hand. But they just made a policy mistake. It was a top-down policy mistake that they made.
Thank you. Ms. Bradbury.
I would echo that and just add that Europe failed to invest in their own energy resources and made themselves dependent on foreign nations. And when you make policy choices not to deploy your own resources, you are left to the whims of others, and that's what we've seen in Europe.
Okay, thank you. Follow up with Dr. Gattie. You know what? I'll submit this one because we're going to run out of time, and I want to be respectful of the chairman of the committee. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Chairman yields back. Mr. Pfluger, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great hearing to acknowledge the role that energy plays in our national security. And I think Dr. Kaufman said just a minute ago that we don't want to shift CO2 intensive industries to other countries, and that's exactly what's going to happen if we continue along with the methane emissions reduction program that's being in a very ill-conceived, rushed manner forced upon many small producers. And I appreciate all of you being here. When I look at the Quad B and Quad C rules that were just released, every operator, no matter their size, will have to test and inspect. I mean, these are very dangerous. And the way that I look at it, representing the Permian Basin, that it's punitive, that this is a weaponization. And most producers that I've talked to were never consulted, and the trade groups and organizations that represent them, and I'll be interested to hear about that in a second, were not consulted. But I do look at this as a weaponization from the EPA. We were looking at not only West Virginia versus the EPA, but the Chevron deference case, the expansion of the administrative state that has, I think, gotten to a point where we have an inappropriate and highly unworkable tax on producers. And when you look at the Subpart W expansion and the overhaul that the EPA has done, it will, in my opinion, make it very difficult to produce. So I'll start with Ms. Bradbury. There's a lot of good actors who voluntarily report, who have reduced methane emissions. We've talked about them in hearings. How will the natural gas tax impact these good actors?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question, and thank you for your energy leadership as well. So we believe that the methane tax is not the best approach to reducing emissions. It is duplicative, inefficient, and it punishes American producers. On top of that, there are a number of ongoing and overlapping methane-related regulations coming out of the EPA that all seem to be compounding. Because on top of the methane tax, which we still have not seen guidance for, despite the fact that it is set to take effect in less than 30 days, they've revised the underlying math by which the methane tax is calculated. And so while, as I understand it, the intent of the methane tax was only to punish those out of compliance with new Quad O or sort of bad actors, now the overwhelming majority of producers will be subject to the methane tax. Just speaking anecdotally from my own member companies, probably less than a third of member companies would have been impacted by the methane tax under its original iteration. Under the new proposed Subpart W, at least 75% will be impacted, and the fees will go up by an order of magnitude 3.5 times of what they originally estimated.
And what's the net impact on those 75% of the companies that you represent, who also, by the way, account for over 50% of the nation's production? So what's the effect on the American population and on our economy?
It's going to be significant. It's hard to say given all of the changing factors. Again, we're not entirely sure how to calculate the methane tax, given we haven't seen the regulations out of EPA. So that's an open question. Where Subpart W lands is an open question. But the fees seem to be escalating with every policy that we see, and we have no certainty in terms of how they will be calculated. Ultimately, a tax on producers will be a tax on the American people, and whether it's hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars, this will be a cost to the American people ultimately.
As you may or may not be aware, for the witnesses, I have a natural gas tax repeal act, and I think that the voluntary program, what producers have done, and by the way, this country at 13+ million barrels a day has also, in that same time period that we've increased, almost doubled in the last 15 years, that production. We've also decreased methane emissions. Very, very concerned about the overall weaponization. And I think the question, Ms. Bradbury, is how many of your companies were consulted and discussed this issue? Because what we keep hearing is this narrative of polluters over people. Well, we've reduced emissions while we've almost doubled production. And people are benefiting from that quality of life increase with all the benefits that are associated. The narrative is that they were consulted. I mean, can you tell us if they were consulted or how this went down in the last year and a half?
So again, there are overlapping rulemakings, and so it's hard to speak on behalf of all of them, sort of, as one size fits all. I will say that there were some constructive conversations with the EPA on the Quad O rule, which we're very appreciative. Others we were not consulted on. I'll note that the White House's methane summit, where they brought in to talk, where they brought in businesses to talk about methane innovations, there was not a single producer represented in that group. So consultations have been limited at best.
Thank you for your testimony, and to all the witnesses today. Chairman, I yield back.
Great questions, and we'll go to the last but not the least, unless another member comes in, Mr. Griffith from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I greatly appreciate it. Dr. Schweitzer, I'm going to ask you some questions, but a lot of the witnesses might be able to, including Ms. Bradbury, really ought to be paying attention because I got some ideas. I'm a big believer in all of the above. I'm also a big believer in technology. One of my big concerns has been is that we are putting so many of our eggs into one basket. There's a few eggs in the fossil fuel basket, but I've been advocating that we have parity between research dollars for fossil fuel and renewables because we need both of them. Would you agree with that?
In as much as we would agree that the best way to subsidize all of the above is to subsidize nothing. Leave it up to a free economy where investors, shareholders are free to invest.
And I can appreciate that, but in reality, the government is going to have to fund some of the research. Then we can let the private players go and do what they need to do. But you're right, private players will play a part in this, and that's why I brought this up, is because I heard one of my colleagues say we're going to put a carbon tax, and she was hoping we would, some of us on this side of the aisle would agree, and I immediately went no, put a carbon tax on the producers. The problem is, as Ms. Bradbury pointed out, if you put a tax, you would agree with this, wouldn't you, Dr. Schweitzer? If you put a tax on the producers, they're just going to pass that tax on to the end user, which is our manufacturers and our citizens. Isn't that true?
Precisely. It hurts everybody. I'm very concerned about how our country seems to be moving from a free economy to a command economy. A command economy with one command after another coming out on this kind of a tax, this kind of a subsidy, this kind of a mandate, and that we seem to be losing faith in our economic and political freedom that created this great country.
And you make a good point, and And the reason I get excited about this is that I come from coal-producing Appalachia. We also have natural gas. We don't have as much as Marcellus and Utica, or we have as much, but it's harder to get to. It's deeper. But one of our big sources that has been flushed away for years is methane in the mines. And now we have a company that has figured out a way to get the methane out of the mine straight from the air. They've got the technology. They've got a whole division working on it that's done it, and they're doing it in Buchanan No. 1, which is a metallurgical coal mine in my district that has a footprint so that people back home can understand. It has an underground footprint bigger than the city of D.C. And they've just decided they're going to open up a whole new area. While it's not quite as high a concentration of the metallurgical coal, it's still high enough to make it profitable. And they've combined with working with a different company to take straight out of the air inside the mine, suck all the methane up, and the end result, they believe, will be profit.
Absolutely. What is the best way to clean up the environment than to make things profitable? Also, the canaries in a coal mine would appreciate getting the methane out of there.
Yeah, we haven't used canaries in a long time, but yes, you're right. Everybody appreciates getting that methane out. Ms. Bradbury, doesn't that sound a whole lot more exciting that maybe we put, if we're going to put dollars in, and Dr. Schweitzer thinks maybe we ought not, but if we're going to put dollars in, isn't it a whole lot more exciting to find ways to solve the problem instead of shutting down American industry or making the cost higher for people in my district to be able to heat their homes?
Mr. Griffith, I think this is a great question, and I think you're exactly right. I think given, growing global energy demand is well established. We've talked a lot about all of the above energy, and I support all of the above energy. I would actually suggest amending that to say best of the above energy. And what you're describing is inclusive of all forms of energy, but in better forms than we've used it traditionally. So I think we need best of all forms of energy as opposed to government policies that pick winners and losers.
Yeah, we don't want to pick winners and losers, and we also don't want to increase costs. That has been our policy for the last 30 years, with a few exceptions. We have decided that we're just going to make the costs go higher. And let me tell you who that affects. I represent a district with take-home pay that's 409th out of 435 congressional districts in the United States. You're not going to affect my family directly. I mean, it may hurt us a little bit, but we're going to be okay. Who you're hurting are those folks on the front lines who are struggling, working to make a living, and are struggling to make ends meet, and who may not qualify for all these programs that my friends on the left would like to say we'd have the programs take care of. Dr. Gattie, my time is up, but maybe as a sidebar, I can get your reactions to some of the things I've said, and I have to yield back at this point and let this meeting come to a close, but I do love the accent. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back, and now go to Ms. Miller-Meeks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for testifying before the committee today. Last week, during the Environment, Manufacturing, and Critical Minerals Subcommittee hearing, we focused on how the United States has been a global leader in reducing greenhouse emissions for the last 2 decades, all while increasing energy production, a fact that I look forward to highlighting at the COP28 in Dubai this weekend. Today, I think it's important to direct our attention on the critical importance of the best of any of the above energy strategy to unleash American energy production, reduce reliance on foreign adversaries, and enhance our electric reliability, all while reducing emissions. A cleaner, healthier environment is not mutually exclusive from abundant, reliable, secure, and most importantly, affordable energy. The winner I want to pick is the United States and the American people. Currently, China accounts for 63% of the world's rare earth mining, 85% of rare earth processing, and 92% of rare earth magnet production. Additionally, China accounts for more than 75% of battery cell production, which will be needed to store energy from less reliable, non-continual sources. Dr. Gattie and Dr. Schweitzer, how are stringent environmental regulation in the United States, specifically around critical mineral mining and processing, further increasing our reliability on China and their horrible environmental practices?
You and me go first? Go ahead.
I appreciate your comments and the question. and especially the idea that we can do it better, cheaper, faster, cleaner in America. There's no question. Our company just completed a plant to make circuit boards. $100 million investment of employee owners' money. Not 1 cent of subsidy was requested or taken from the federal government or the states. This plant is in Moscow, Idaho. We have worked hard to make it the cleanest, greenest circuit board plant on this planet because, let's face it, people like things to be clean and efficient. Efficiency, cleanliness, creativity, these are all appealing to the human spirit. There's no need to subsidize these things, that we can do it at home. And a big key for this is to make it easier to build a plant, to look for something new, whether it's underground or in somebody's mind. That these are the things that I believe our Congress can be doing for we the people, that we can do it here in America better, cheaper, faster, cleaner.
I'll alter that question a little bit and say, what are the greatest regulatory barriers that currently exist for utilizing advanced nuclear reactors to meet domestic energy production objectives? And what are the barriers for restoring the United States as a major global exporter of nuclear technology?
Thank you, Dr. Middlemeeks, for the question. The barriers really right now, they're financial, they are supply chain oriented, and we simply have not gone past the non-recurring engineering phases to get up to production scale. We need a demand signal. We need a nuclear policy strategy. We can't continue to just do one-off nuclear construction when we don't even have an enrichment capacity right now to provide the resources. We are not coordinated in this, and it's not a priority, and it needs to be a priority.
So a priority and a policy that is supportive of nuclear energy would in fact be the demand signal that we're looking for.
That would be a great first step.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for an energy policy from this administration. Ms. Bradbury, what role does carbon capture, storage, and utilization technologies and innovation play in reducing U.S. emissions moving forward? And what federal policies are needed to increase accessibility and utilization of these technologies?
Ms. Miller-Meeks, thank you so much for the question. I will say that between the IEA, this administration, the DOE, there is wide-scale agreement that CCUS has a critical role to play in meeting climate objectives, particularly among hard-to-abate sectors. Some of the issues that we're seeing with full scalability of carbon capture include permitting reform and the need for permitting reform in pipelines. I would also say with regard to the permitting of wells, there are only 2 states right now that have primacy when it comes to the permitting of Class 6 wells, Wyoming and North Dakota. There are a number of states that have pending applications with the EPA for state primacy. States have the most expertise in permitting this type of well, and that would be an important step in the right direction.
Thank you. I yield back.
Jolie yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from the beautiful Savannah area of Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to wave on. Dr. Gattie, I suspect you're as disappointed as I am, results of Saturday afternoon, but nevertheless, we move on. Thank you for being here. You've been here quite often, and we appreciate it. And thank all of you for being here, as a matter of fact. But Dr. Gattie, I noticed that in your testimony, you made the point, and you made it before, about this rush to green and how we're sacrificing our global competitiveness, and I couldn't agree with you more. As I think I've told you before, I've been to Europe as a member of the Conservative Climate Caucus, and I've seen what has happened there, where they've allowed their policies to get ahead of their innovation, and now they're backtracking, even having to use coal in some instances. And I fear that we may be doing the same thing. I'm very concerned about our home state of Georgia and about the fact that we're investing a lot in green energy, and as we should, and that's good. But even with the Hyundai plant coming, what happens if we get a change in administration and all of a sudden we shift gears and we're not headed toward this down this path anymore. But nevertheless, that's a chance we take. And it's also concerning to me about, this is a global problem. We all understand that. Everyone here understands it's a global problem when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions or when we're talking about carbon emissions. Even in India, it's one of the largest emitters. They admit that they plan to still depend on coal well into the future, and we know that China is providing them with that. So let me ask you, Dr. Gattie, how do these rush to green policies and regulations that have been proposed by the current administration, how do they impact the U.S.'s ability to compete and to power our economy?
Congressman Carter, it's good to have you here. I would like to, for the record, to say that the chair made a very hurtful remark earlier to the gentleman from Alabama. With regard to the policy impacts on this, it's going to be a recurring point from myself and from my colleagues that I work with at the University of Georgia. This is going to fundamentally restructure and reorganize our industrial base. It's going to change it. One of the most principled impacts that it's going to have is the resources that Ms. Bradbury has talked about, our fossil fuel resources. These represent stored energy resources. They're in the ground. They're there for us to use whenever we need them. Primary energy resources. To shift to an industrial strategy where we have to manufacture our stored energy in terms of batteries, we don't know the consequences, and we don't know if our industrial base can stand up to our competitors in that way. We're looking at electrifying our economy. We don't know if an electrified economy, an electrified America, can stand up to competitors. There are more unknowns than there are knowns. So restructuring it around carbon reduction as the tip of the spear instead of security as the tip of the spear raises more questions than it does answers.
Great. You and I both know, and I think everyone knows about the state of Georgia and our use of nuclear energy, and I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud that we have the first nuclear reactors built in over 30 years in this country, and I think it adds to our national security perspective. In fact, I think you mentioned this in your testimony as well. You also said in your testimony that renewables should be included in a diverse energy portfolio, but not as replacement resources, as they will not deliver the same value to America's industrial base as fossil fuels or nuclear. How have states embraced more diverse energy portfolios, or how the states that have embraced more diverse energy portfolios, how are they doing economically and competitive? Our state of Georgia, I would say that we have a very diverse energy portfolio, and we're #1 state in the nation to do business for the 11th straight year.
So, Congressman, I've spoken at what's probably about 15 or 20 states over the past 3 years at their states' sections of electric power. They envy where we are at Georgia. They envy states that have diverse resources. Industries in those states are looking for places that have not only affordable electricity, but reliable, and also those states that are looking long-term, that are structuring their power sector not around just carbon reduction, but around an energy future actually that's going to serve grandchildren and not just the current generation. We're doing that in Georgia, and a lot of the currently the regulated market states like Georgia is, that's what we're able to do through integrated resource planning.
Great. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and go Dogs.
Yeah, go Dogs.
You could have left that last phrase out.
It's over time.
I'm not going to say it, Scott. You can say Roll Tide if you want to. I think I said it earlier, but anyway. Look, I want to just thank all of you for being here. This was very informative for all the members, and I hate that more members didn't jump in here, but the ones that are going to COP23 are engaged in this, and we're all working for the betterment of America, as you are. So thank you for that. I'll remind members that you have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask witnesses to do their best to submit responses within 10 business days upon receipt of the questions, if there are any. I also ask unanimous consent to insert in the record The documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that'll be the order. And without objection, the subcommittee will stand adjourned.